What if there was a unit so feared that even the Hells Angels themselves whisper its name? They don't answer to chapters. They don't recognize borders. Their only loyalty is to blood and silence. And to join them, you must first kill. Hidden behind the chaos of 66 countries and nearly 6,000 members lies a shadow Brotherhood 1 that operates like an invisible military inside a motorcycle empire. This isn't about rebellion anymore. This is organized fear. This is the Nomads. The elite within the elite. Most people think they understand the Hells Angels' loud engines, leather jackets, brotherhood, and rebellion. But what most of the world never sees is the hierarchy within the chaos. Deep inside this sprawling network of 592 chapters across 66 countries lies a secret division. A unit so exclusive, so ruthless, that even longtime angels refer to them with caution. They are known only by one name: Nomads. Unlike every other Hells Angels chapter that claims territory, California, Toronto, Sydney Nomads belong nowhere. Their bottom rocker doesn't show a place, it shows a single word: Nomads. That single word means something profound in the outlaw world. It means you answer to no local president, no city boss, no border, and often not even to national authority. You answer only to the highest power in the Angels' global command. In the traditional biker hierarchy, a full patch member's world is defined by boundaries, streets, cities, and regional politics. But the Nomads live outside that map. They are a roaming strike force, authorized to cross into any territory without permission. Where others see lines, they see open roads. If a problem arises that a local chapter can't handle or won't handle, it's the Nomads who are sent to resolve it. Quietly, permanently. Law enforcement agencies across the world have documented how the Nomads function like a Black Ops wing of the Angels. In Australia, they've been called the Club's Special Forces. In Canada, police labeled them the Commandos of Organized Crime. Dutch prosecutors, after years of infiltration attempts, concluded the Nomads exist to execute what other chapters can't officially endorse: murders, enforcement, and cross-border trafficking. Inside the organization, the Nomads are not simply respected, they are feared. Regular members might boast about loyalty, tattoos, or biker codes, but the Nomads' power is built on something far more tangible: their ability to kill without hesitation and to vanish without consequence. It's not uncommon for even senior angels to step aside when a Nomad walks into the room. Their word outweighs titles, their patch heavier than rank. And then there's the recruitment. To join a local chapter, you ride, prospect, prove loyalty. To join the Nomads, you must prove something else: violence without hesitation. The process filters out the untested and the fearful. Every member must have history, not just of crime, but of control. The kind of cold composure it takes to pull a trigger and not flinch. Birth of the Quebec Nomads, the godfather of fear.
Angels.
The police finally have a secret weapon. A super spy inside the Hells Angels.
June 24th, 1995. Montreal was already burning under the weight of the Quebec biker war bombings, shootings, and executions, turning city streets into front lines. But that day marked something far darker than turf warfare. It marked the creation of a weaponized chapter that would redefine outlaw power in Canada. Maurice Mom Boucher, the most feared figure to ever wear the Death Head patch, founded the Hells Angels Nomads Quebec chapter unit with no borders, no mercy, and one rule above all: kill or be forgotten. Boucher's vision wasn't about rebellion or identity, it was about consolidation. He realized that traditional biker hierarchies, tied to cities and territories, created limitations. Local chapters had presidents, politics, and ego battles. He wanted something different: a centralized strike unit that could act instantly, answer only to him, and move across Canada like a ghost army. The Nomads were born not as bikers, but as operatives. Every detail of the chapter's creation was calculated. Prospective members weren't chosen for loyalty, they were chosen for capability. Court documents from Operation Springtime, the massive 2001 police sweep, later revealed that to even be considered for Quebec's Nomads, one had to commit murder, not just be willing, not just discuss it. It had to be done, documented, proven. That requirement wasn't sadism, it was strategy. No undercover agent could ever fake it. By making homicide the entry price, Boucher created an impenetrable wall against law enforcement infiltration. In effect, he built the first biker chapter in history where the only qualification was blood. Within a year, the results were staggering. The Nomads became the central command of the Hells Angels operations in Canada, outranking every regional chapter. They weren't merely members, they were administrators of violence. Their duties included settling disputes, managing cocaine pipelines, and enforcing club taxation, the drug tax every dealer in Quebec had to pay to operate under Angels' control. Law enforcement would later describe Boucher's leadership style as corporate. Every member had a role. Some were killers, some were couriers, and others were coordinators. But all were loyal to one thing, the system of power Boucher had built. He called it La Table. It was a council of killers that set the price of drugs, approved murders, and coordinated logistics with the Italian mafia. Cocaine would move in from South America through Montreal's ports, distributed through biker channels, and taxed at $50,000 a kilogram. Anyone caught selling below that price simply disappeared. What separated the Quebec Nomads from every other criminal outfit was their ability to merge business and murder. They weren't chaos, they were calculation. Every hit was a boardroom decision, everybody a message. Their influence stretched from small-town dealers to international cartels. Their power reinforced by a reputation for efficiency that even the mafia acknowledged. Murder as a membership requirement, blood before brotherhood.
It goes boom, and when they blew it, they didn't give a shit.
For most outlaw bikers, membership begins with loyalty. You hang around, earn trust, prove commitment, and one day, the patch is yours. But for the Nomads, loyalty isn't measured by time or trust. It's measured in blood. To wear their patch, you must have killed. Not metaphorically, not by rumor documented, confirmed, and proven beyond doubt. Murder isn't a consequence of their world, it's the price of admission. Maurice Mom Boucher designed this system in the mid-1990s when paranoia and infiltration were tearing outlaw clubs apart. Police informants were crippling entire chapters across Canada and the United States. Undercover agents had successfully infiltrated gangs, posing as mechanics, bodyguards, even prospects. Boucher saw a weakness. If anyone could prospect, anyone could betray. His answer was ruthless simplicity. Make the initiation so extreme that no cop could ever complete it. The murder requirement didn't just protect the organization, it reshaped it. It turned recruitment into filtration. Each kill became both proof of loyalty and a criminal fingerprint the club could use as leverage forever. Once you'd killed for the Nomads, you could never truly leave. Your crime bound you to them. The blood you spilled was your lifetime contract. One of the most chilling examples came from the case of Stéphane Goddas-Guertin, a young biker desperate for nomad status. On June 26, 1997, he and fellow Angel André Toots Toussaint targeted prison guard Diane Lavigne as she left work in Montreal. Riding double on a motorcycle, they pulled alongside her car and opened fire, killing her instantly. The act was senseless to the public, but to the club, it was initiation. Within days, Guertin and Toussaint were accepted as prospects half-patched, halfway human. Wiretaps later captured Toussaint calling his wife to brag, "I got my patch yesterday." She responded, "I'm so proud of you." In that single exchange lay the horror of nomad culture murder normalized. Violence celebrated as achievement. The patch system became their resume. Each symbol on their vest documented what others would call atrocities. Police later uncovered ledgers and coded notes showing that each kill was recorded. Every member's contribution was logged, creating a black market ledger of death that doubled as insurance. Betray the club, and they wouldn't just expose your crimes, they'd replay them in court. It was a system of loyalty enforced by guilt. International expansion, Nomads worldwide. What began as a Canadian experiment in control didn't stay contained for long. By the late 1990s, the Nomads concept had crossed oceans, embedding itself into the Hells Angels network like a second bloodstream. Across Europe, Australia, and beyond, new Nomads chapters appeared, each operating with the same terrifying autonomy that made the Quebec model untouchable. They had no borders, no oversight, and no limits. The United Kingdom was among the first to see this transformation. In February 1989, the Hells Angels Nomads England chapter was officially established, marking a turning point in European outlaw culture. Their website described them as men of great character, strength, and honor. But behind the rhetoric lay something darker. Law enforcement would soon learn that this chapter's independence wasn't poetic. It was lethal. In 1997, senior English nomad Stephen Grumps Cunningham vanished after boarding a ferry to the Netherlands. Dutch investigators later discovered that he had been executed and dumped in a canal, allegedly by members of the Amsterdam Hells Angels, under contract from Cunningham's own chapter. His crime wasn't betrayal of the club itself. His death revealed an unsettling truth. Nomads were autonomous enough to arrange cross-border assassinations against their own members. Loyalty wasn't protection, it was probation. In Germany, police raids during the 2000s uncovered Nomads chapters running weapons pipelines that stretched from Eastern Europe to Scandinavia. One 2009 arrest in Potsdam, during the opening of a new Hells Angels pub, exposed a fugitive nomad wanted for arms trafficking. He'd been living openly among his brothers, protected not by secrecy, but by the simple fact that law enforcement didn't know which country's jurisdiction he belonged to. The patch Nomads meant everywhere and nowhere. In the Netherlands, authorities fought a losing war against the club's presence. Investigators described their operations as borderless business. Nomads from Denmark would appear in Amsterdam one week, then vanish into Germany the next. They weren't fugitives in hiding, they were operators in motion. The structure made traditional law enforcement tactics obsolete. You couldn't raid a territory that didn't exist. Australia's Nomads took the system even further. Originally established in Sydney during the 1980s, the Australian Nomads became known as the enforcers of enforcers. They weren't just internal muscle, they handled international coordination, arms deals, and political corruption through Bicky networks that spanned the Pacific. Police task forces repeatedly called them untouchable. In 2012, Australian intelligence confirmed that the Nomads were actively supporting organized crime in Southeast Asia, particularly through methamphetamine distribution and weapons trade. The global spread of Nomads chapters reflected a new form of criminal evolution. These were no longer localized gangs competing for neighborhoods. They were mobile syndicates, capable of crossing borders faster than any extradition treaty could track them. Their mobility meant resilience. When one country cracked down, another chapter absorbed operations seamlessly. Each Nomads chapter operated like a franchise of fear, independent, profitable, and expendable. They shared intelligence across encrypted channels, coordinated enforcement hits, and managed logistics for everything from narcotics to human trafficking. And while each country's laws differed, their loyalty didn't. The patch was the passport. Drug empires and Murder Inc., the business of terror.
Like that, they warned him, he didn't accept the warnings. In the end, they had him killed.
By the late 1990s, the Quebec Nomads had evolved beyond violence. They had become a corporation of death. The engines, the patches, the bravado were only surface details. Beneath it all, they were running one of the most sophisticated criminal economies in Canadian history. Every kilogram of cocaine, every ounce of methamphetamine, every deal struck in back alleys or luxury condos passed through their invisible system of taxation. Violence wasn't chaos anymore, it was policy. At the top sat La Table Council of Nomads, led by Maurice Mom Boucher, functioning like an underworld board of directors. Their first decree, all cocaine sold in Quebec would cost $50,000 per kilogram. No exceptions. The rule wasn't a guideline, it was law. Dealers caught underselling didn't get fined, they vanished. Law enforcement later discovered ledgers in Nomad safehouses listing dozens of names crossed out in red ink. Every one of them had sold below the price, every one of them had been erased. This structured brutality turned the drug trade into a machine that generated millions monthly. Through strategic alliances with the Sicilian mafia, Particularly the Rizzuto family, the Nomads controlled both supply and distribution. Cocaine flowed from South America into Montreal's ports, where mafia contacts handled import logistics and biker couriers managed inland transport. Nomads provided the muscle, mafia the connections, and together they created a monopoly powerful enough to dictate street prices across the entire province. It wasn't just drugs. The Nomads diversified into protection rackets, money laundering, and contract enforcement. Businesses paid for security they didn't need because the alternative was destruction. Bar owners, strip clubs, and even construction companies fell under their umbrella. Every dollar that entered the underground economy passed through Nomads' hands. For the first time in Canadian criminal history, one chapter had successfully centralized organized crime under a single violent management structure. But empires built on fear are empires built on paranoia. The system devoured its own. When internal disputes over profits arose, executions followed. One of the most infamous victims was Louis Melou Roy, president of the Trois-Rivières Hells Angels chapter and a founding member of the Nomads. After questioning Boucher's pricing system, Roy was invited to a 5th anniversary party for the chapter. He never came home. His body was never found. Police later confirmed he had been murdered on direct orders from La Table. In the world of the Nomads, disagreement was treason. Their efficiency stunned law enforcement. The Nomads operated like a multinational conglomerate, complete with accountants, couriers, and enforcers. Wiretaps revealed coded conversations about contracts and deliveries. Terms that referred as often referred to human lives as to drugs. Investigators began to call them Murder Inc. North Network, where violence wasn't emotional, it was transactional. Every hit had a budget. Everybody was an invoice. Between 1994 and 2002, more than 160 people died in the Quebec Biker War. Roughly half were directly linked to the Nomads' enforcement of drug discipline. Their message to rivals, police, and partners was the same: control isn't declared, it's demonstrated. Digital Nomads of Death, Evolution in the Shadows. When the engines quieted and the street wars faded, the Nomads didn't die, they adapted. The 21st century turned its methods from asphalt to algorithms. What once required guns, safe houses, and coded phone calls could now be done with encryption, cryptocurrency, and a laptop. The Hells Angels Nomads were no longer just riders. They were architects of a digital underworld that made geography irrelevant. Investigators in Canada and Europe began noticing a new pattern around 2015. The Nomads' public visibility had dropped sharply. No flashy clubhouses, no loud rallies, no visible leaders. Yet their financial trails multiplied. Bitcoin wallets tied to known Nomad associates moved hundreds of thousands of dollars across exchanges in Hong Kong, Dubai, and Cyprus. Police traced them to online dark market vendors selling weapons, synthetic opioids, and forged passports. The Nomads had turned the internet into their new highway. Encrypted communication became their strongest armor. Apps like Threema, Wicker, and specially modified BlackBerry devices allowed entire chapters to communicate globally without interception. The same organizational logic that once controlled drug routes across Quebec was now being used to manage crypto wallets, smuggling routes, and contract payments in real time. Intelligence analysts described them as a decentralized digital cartel. The psychological warfare changed too. Fear was no longer spread through gunfire, it spread through silence. Rumors circulated that certain online posts criticizing the Angels were traced, and the posters disappeared. Whether true or not, the threat kept everyone quiet. Power through uncertainty had always been the Nomads' greatest weapon. Even recruitment has evolved. The old murder requirement remained in spirit, but now it included digital qualifications. Candidates had to demonstrate not only criminal capability, but technical skill, encryption knowledge, access to darknet markets, or connections to cyber laundering networks. Background checks were no longer word of mouth. They were algorithmic, using secure channels and layered identities to verify trust. Law enforcement called it criminal blockchain vetting, a system almost impossible to infiltrate. Behind the myth, the real Nomads refined their control. Digital banking gave them reach far beyond narcotics. They invested in shell companies, construction firms, and import businesses, filtering illicit profits into legitimate economies. Cryptocurrency anonymized it all, erasing the trail faster than police could trace it. What had started as biker extortion had evolved into a global portfolio. To law enforcement, it felt like chasing ghosts. Every time an operation targeted a suspected leader, the network shifted. New aliases appeared, messages self-deleted. Servers vanished overnight. The Nomads had mastered the principle that kept them alive for decades, never exist long enough to be understood. By 2020, they were something unrecognizable. Not a gang, not a club, but a living system of organized anonymity. The roads they once ruled had become digital. The leather vests were replaced by encryption keys. And while their engines no longer echoed through the night, their presence still haunted the dark corners of the web, where loyalty is coded in binary and blood. Global crackdowns and law enforcement response, nations against ghosts. By the early 2000s, governments across the world finally began to understand what they were up against. The Hells Angels Nomads weren't just a biker gang. They were a decentralized organism, a network of criminals that ignored borders, treaties, and traditional enforcement structures. Every attempt to dismantle them revealed the same truth. You can't destroy what doesn't officially exist. The first major coordinated strike came in 2001 with Operation Springtime. It was the largest criminal sweep in Canadian history, a multi-agency offensive that targeted the Hells Angels and their support clubs across Quebec. When the smoke cleared, 142 bikers were in custody, almost the entire Quebec Nomads chapter among them. Authorities celebrated it as a victory, believing they had decapitated the most violent wing of the Angels. But within months, something unnerving happened. Other chapters simply absorbed their operations. The Trois-Rivières chapter stepped in, taking over coordination duties, and membership in Quebec increased. The Nomads hadn't fallen, they had multiplied. Law enforcement began to realize they were chasing an idea rather than an organization. In Europe, the Netherlands took the most radical step. After years of investigating murder, extortion, and drug cases tied to Nomads chapters, Dutch prosecutors argued that the Hells Angels were not a club, but a criminal organization designed for violence. Their legal filings described the Nomads as the operational brain of the Angels, responsible for enforcing control through intimidation and murder. The Dutch courts agreed. In 2019, they became the first country to officially ban the Hells Angels outright. Belgium followed, criminalizing membership entirely. Police intelligence reports made it clear why. Nomads chapters were coordinating cross-border trafficking networks that stretched from Antwerp's docks to Eastern Europe's arms dealers. Even when leaders were arrested, operations continued. Emails, encrypted calls, and offshore bank accounts kept the machine running. It wasn't just organized crime, it was organized continuity. Australia's approach was different. State governments created anti-bikie task forces, deploying military-style raids on known Nomads properties and freezing assets through anti-consorting laws. Yet each crackdown revealed the same problem. For every clubhouse closed, another opened under a new front. For every seized motorcycle, another appeared under a different name. The Nomads' decentralized design made them self-healing. Technology became their greatest weapon. Police wiretaps often picked up only coded fragments, phrases like move the table, change the color, or ride clean. Each phrase could mean money, drugs, or murder. Without physical jurisdiction, enforcement became symbolic. Governments could raid a house, but not a hierarchy. By the 2010s, Interpol stepped in, forming Project Sabre, an international intelligence sharing task force dedicated to mapping the Hells Angels' global structure. The data shocked even veteran investigators. Nomads chapters weren't confined to one nation. They were actively cooperating across at least 17 countries, exchanging intelligence and financial resources like a multinational company. Their communications were encrypted, their meetings arranged in neutral zones like Dubai or the Canary Islands, and their funds routed through crypto laundering platforms. The Netherlands National Police described the challenge in a single phrase: "They don't live anywhere, so you can't evict them." The terror within, why angels fear the Nomads.
Walter Stadnick might not have looked much, but the Canadian took the Hells Angels from mafia errand boys to world's toughest group after founding the Nomads.
Inside the sprawling network of the Hells Angels, power is everything earned through rank, reputation, and brutality. But even among the most hardened members, one chapter evokes silence. The Nomads. They are the Angels' secret mirror, an elite force that enforces discipline through fear. Regular chapters see them not as brothers, but as executioners with patches. And for good reason. When the Nomads arrive, it usually means someone inside the organization has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. The Hells Angels are built on the motto, Angels Forever, Forever Angels. In theory, it means loyalty for life. In reality, it's a warning: once you're in, you're never out. The Nomads exist to enforce that law. They don't punish outsiders, they punish betrayal from within. Former members who defected to law enforcement have described the atmosphere they create as controlled terror. Even high-ranking presidents tread carefully when Nomads are in the room. The murder of Louis Melu Roy, a founding Nomad and president of the Trois-Rivières chapter, is the most chilling example of this internal brutality. Roy had objected to the Nomads' strict cocaine pricing system, believing it was bad for business. On June 25, 2000, he attended what was supposed to be a celebration, the 5th anniversary of the Nomads' founding. He never left alive. His body was never found. Investigators later confirmed he was executed on orders from La Table Same leadership council he helped create. In the Nomads world, questioning authority isn't dissent, it's suicide. But the threat doesn't stop with disobedience. In 1997, across the Atlantic, English nomad Stephen Grumps Cunningham was murdered after a dispute with his own chapter. The contract wasn't handled internally. It was outsourced to the Amsterdam Hells Angels. Cunningham's death proved that Nomads' reach extended beyond geography, and that loyalty wasn't shield, it was surveillance. The system devours its own to sustain itself. To outsiders, the Hells Angels are a brotherhood. To insiders, the Nomads are a reminder of what that brotherhood costs. Members describe them as men without fear, but what that really means is they've already crossed every moral boundary. Their violence isn't a reaction, it's procedure. The Nomads maintain control not just through force, but through psychology. They study members' weaknesses, debts, and family connections. When disobedience surfaces, punishment is tailored to send a message. Sometimes it's a beating, sometimes it's disappearance, but always it's final. The fear they command is deliberate. Law enforcement wiretaps from the early 2000s captured regular Angels warning each other never to cross Nomads' business. You don't touch their money, you don't question their calls, one member said. They don't argue, they replace you. Even the Hells Angels International Board respects their power. Nomads often act as mediators in global disputes between chapters, but their involvement carries the weight of death. If they arrive at negotiate, the decision is already made. The result might be exile, or it might be execution. Either way, no one refuses. The Shadow Empire, the Hells Angels' invisible kingdom. By the time the world began to piece together what the Nomads truly were, they had already evolved beyond comprehension. Beneath the roar of Harley engines and the illusion of chaos, they had built something unprecedented. A global, decentralized criminal empire operating without borders, titles, or mercy. To the public, they were the Hells Angels' most secretive chapter. To the underworld, they were the ruling shadow. What makes the Nomads so terrifying isn't their size, it's their structure. They don't rely on hierarchy the way traditional crime families do. There's no fixed leader, no defined territory, and no permanent headquarters. Each Nomads chapter operates like a node in a neural network, autonomous, adaptive, and connected through encrypted communication. If one node is destroyed, the system reroutes. The empire survives. Law enforcement officials across Canada and Europe have called them the Ghost Syndicate, an organism that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. Their strength lies in invisibility. While regular Hells Angels chapters display their colors proudly, marking their territory with patches and public runs, the Nomads thrive in the unseen. They infiltrate, they observe, they act when others can't. Former members describe them as the angels that never sleep. When tensions rise between chapters, it's the nomads who appear uninvited, their arrival signaling that the matter will be resolved, one way or another. Unlike the mafia, whose leadership hierarchy is a matter of historical record, the nomads' command structure is deliberately fluid. Decisions are made by consensus between senior enforcers, many of whom operate under multiple identities. Their communications move through encrypted servers and secure intermediaries. No member knows all others. No operation is fully visible to anyone but the core. This compartmentalization ensures that betrayal is impossible without self-destruction. The result is terrifying efficiency. In the 2000s, as police dismantled one Nomads network in Quebec, new ones quietly emerged in Europe, in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Each carried the same operational DNA: small, violent, financially intelligent, and utterly loyal. They didn't compete with local chapters, they overruled them. Their role was no longer about territory or pride. It was about maintaining the balance of power within the world's largest outlaw brotherhood. Even the global expansion of the Hells Angels, now spanning over 66 countries, owes its stability to the Nomads' unseen hand. Whenever regional wars erupted between biker gangs, from Scandinavia to the Balkans, Nomad mediators appeared, enforcing peace through calculated fear. Behind the scenes, they became the Angels' international police. Assassins and diplomats rolled into one. Their financial operations are just as intricate. Shell companies in Eastern Europe launder drug profits through logistics firms and construction contracts. Offshore accounts in the Caribbean conceal the earnings of smuggling networks that link South America to Europe and Australia. The Nomads aren't chasing chaos, they're managing it, turning global disorder into structured, repeatable income. What's most chilling, though, is their adaptability. Every time law enforcement declares victory, the Nomads change tactics, swapping motorcycles for cargo trucks, paper trails for digital wallets. They have evolved from riders to strategists, from visible outlaws to invisible architects of crime. Blood currency, how violence became the Angels' economy. In most criminal enterprises, money is the measure of success. For the Nomads, it's blood. Every dollar earned, every patch awarded, every alliance formed is paid for in violence. It's not chaos, it's currency. And within the Hells Angels' invisible hierarchy, the Nomads are the mint. They decide who lives, who dies, and who gets to keep earning under their shadow. Violence for them isn't random, it's structured. The Nomads treat murder the way corporations treat mergers and acquisitions, as strategic moves to maintain market dominance. When a dealer sells cocaine below Nomad's set price, his death isn't revenge, it's economic enforcement. When a rival gang moves into their city, the ensuing bloodshed isn't turf war, it's cost control. Every act of brutality stabilizes profit and deters competition. By the late 1990s, law enforcement uncovered that the Nomads had weaponized fear into a business tool. Boucher's Quebec Council La Table didn't just dictate drug prices, it decided who could sell, where, and for how much. Anyone operating outside that structure faced execution. This brutal consistency built an empire worth tens of millions in annual revenue. Police wiretaps recorded Nomads joking about writing invoices after shootings, a chilling euphemism for collecting payments after murders sanctioned by the club. But their economy extended beyond narcotics. Extortion, protection rackets, and money laundering formed a triad of profit streams, all backed by violence. Business owners across Montreal, Laval, and Sherbrooke paid insurance fees to avoid broken windows or worse. The Nomads didn't need contracts. The fear was contract enough. If a business owner refused, his bar might burn down overnight, or he might vanish before dawn. Their alliance with organized crime families like the Rizzutos turned this violence into legitimacy within the underworld. The mafia provided logistics and financial cover. The Nomads provided enforcement. Together they created a closed-loop system of control where money and murder fed each other endlessly. One of the most revealing moments came during Operation Springtime in 2001, when prosecutors presented ledgers recovered from Nomad safe houses. They weren't filled with financial figures, but with initials, dates, and cryptic notes like paid in full or settled. Every one of those entries, investigators learned, represented a human life. The Nomads didn't just account for cash, they accounted for corpses. Their economy was self-regulating. Members who killed on behalf of the club earned prestige patches like Filthy Few or Dequile, symbolic currency exchanged for loyalty and protection. The more violence one commits, the higher his rank, the greater his access to profits. In this world, morality wasn't just absent, it was inverted. Killing wasn't the cost of business, it was the business. Even when the Nomads expanded internationally, the blood economy remained intact. In Europe, contracts became more professionalized, outsourced to trusted affiliates in other chapters, or even rival gangs. A hit in Germany could be ordered from Canada and executed in hours. The digital age only streamlined the process of payments in cryptocurrency, communication through encrypted channels, and instructions disguised as innocent messages. The murder requirement, no infiltration allowed.
He seemed to love it. Quebec's biker war raged for 8 years. More than 160 people were killed.
Infiltrating the Hells Angels was never easy, but infiltrating the Nomads was impossible. Their existence was designed around a single cold-blooded principle. No one can join unless their hands are already stained with blood. It wasn't a myth or initiation legend, it was policy crafted with precision by Maurice "Mom" Boucher during the Quebec biker wars. The rule guaranteed one thing: every nomad had already committed a crime that made undercover policing suicidal. For law enforcement, it was an unsolvable paradox. Traditional infiltration relies on trust and patience building credibility over months, sometimes years. But how could any police officer, no matter how deep their cover, pass a test that required them to kill? Boucher had understood this perfectly. He didn't just create a club, he engineered a fortress. The murder requirement emerged in 1995 when Boucher officially formed the Nomads chapter in Quebec. It wasn't hidden. It was whispered through the underworld, a message meant to deter outsiders and weed out the unworthy. If you wanted the Nomads patch, you had to prove your loyalty with blood. Candidates often performed killings under supervision, ensuring the act was witnessed and verified. Once complete, their names were entered into what investigators would later describe as a ledger of death. That record doubled as insurance proof of loyalty and blackmail if needed. The logic was flawless. Murder is irreversible. It binds the killer to the organization forever because exposure means prison or execution. Every nomad, by design, was trapped inside his own crime. Loyalty wasn't just emotional, it was structural. This recruitment model also served another purpose. It created an instant hierarchy. Those willing to kill without hesitation earned power immediately. Those who hesitated never advanced. The result was a chapter made entirely of men who had already crossed the point of no return. They were unemotional, efficient, and utterly immune to guilt. The system's effectiveness was revealed during Operation Printemps 2001, Canada's largest anti-biker operation. Prosecutors discovered that every nomad arrested had direct involvement in at least one homicide. Police analysts called it the first organization with murder as a membership policy. It explained why no law enforcement agent, no matter how skilled, ever got inside. But Boucher's innovation didn't stay contained in Quebec. Intelligence reports later revealed that nomad chapters in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands adopted their own versions of the requirement, sometimes substituting murder for other acts of extreme violence, like attacking police officers or rival club leaders. The logic was the same: make entry impossible for anyone who hadn't already destroyed their legal life. Even communication between nomads followed this philosophy. Messages were coded, compartmentalized, and sometimes self-incriminating by design. If a message was intercepted, it would link only to people already beyond redemption. There was nothing to expose that the club didn't already know. To outside observers, the system looked monstrous. To the nomads, it was purity. Every member had proved beyond doubt that loyalty outweighed morality. Every handshake came from a man who had killed and could kill again. This requirement didn't just keep the police out, it kept fear in. The nomads weren't criminals who might kill, they were killers who happened to be criminals. Over time, that distinction became the essence of their legend. It's why their name carries such weight in the underworld, why even allied gangs hesitate to cross them. The nomads' greatest weapon was never their firepower, their bikes, or their numbers. It was this simple, devastating truth that one joins by pretending to be dangerous. You join by proving you already are. International expansion. Nomads without borders. What began as a Canadian experiment in controlled violence quickly spread across oceans. The Nomads weren't just a chapter anymore, they became a franchise of fear. A global network of Hells Angels operatives untethered from geography or governance. From Montreal to Manchester, Berlin to Sydney, the Nomads brand evolved into the elite backbone of international biker power. Wherever they appeared, violence followed and order soon after. The first European Nomads chapter was founded in England in 1989, a strategic move during a volatile period in the UK's criminal underworld. While other Angels chapters clashed with rival biker gangs and police, the English Nomads kept a low profile, but beneath that quiet surface, they were enforcing internal discipline with brutal precision. In 1997, senior Nomads member Stephen "Grumps" Cunningham vanished after boarding a ferry bound for the Netherlands. Dutch police later learned he'd been murdered allegedly by Amsterdam Angels. Under contract from Cunningham's own chapter, his death marked a precedent. The Nomads could reach across borders, even against their own. By the early 2000s, the model had replicated across Europe. Germany's Berlin Nomads became infamous for their ongoing territorial wars with the Bandidos and Gremium MCs. Battles fought with grenades and automatic weapons in public streets. In Denmark, the Copenhagen Nomads were instrumental in consolidating the Hells Angels' dominance during the Nordic biker wars, orchestrating hits on rivals and maintaining weapons caches that rivaled small militias. Each chapter operated independently, but followed the same unwritten constitution answer to no one: show no weakness, and enforce the club's global interests with extreme violence. Law enforcement agencies began noticing how these nomad units functioned like military detachments, not motorcycle clubs. They weren't social riders, they were operational cells. Intelligence sharing, logistics, and recruitment were all handled with the discipline of a covert agency. Each chapter contained men already wanted in other countries, protected by the Nomads' unofficial passport, fear. Their reputation alone ensured safe passage through ports and borders, where ordinary criminals would never survive scrutiny. In Australia, the arrival of the Nomads around 2007 changed the entire biker landscape. The Sydney Nomads broke away from the traditional Hells Angels structure, forming their own hybrid empire that combined outlaw biker culture with local organized crime. They moved quickly into drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and high-end extortion rackets. Police reports later confirmed that their operations extended across New South Wales, Queensland, and even into Southeast Asia, creating one of the most profitable chapters outside North America. What made the Nomads' global expansion unstoppable was adaptability. Each region's chapter tailored itself to its environment. In Europe, they exploited legal loopholes around association laws. In Australia, they infiltrated local street gangs to establish control from the bottom up. In Canada, they retained their status as the enforcers of the old guard, guarding alliances with mafia families and cartel liaisons. Every chapter shared a single ethos: mobility equals survival. The network they built had no borders, no presidents, and no weak points. Nomads in different continents could coordinate without ever meeting, using encrypted digital channels and coded language that baffled even experienced investigators. Some messages appeared to be ordinary biker talk discussions about rides, colors, or oil changes, but each carried operational meaning. To law enforcement, dismantling them became a global nightmare. Arrests in one country triggered retaliations in another. Informants disappeared. Witnesses recanted. The Nomads had become something that transcended both national and criminal boundaries. An ecosystem of loyal killers, each bound not by location, but by ideology. Their motto remained the same across languages: no territory, no borders, no mercy. The Hells Angels had always been a symbol of rebellion. But the nomads turned rebellion into structure, structure into business, and business into an empire that spanned continents. They weren't just the Angels' most elite chapter. They were their global nervous system, pulsing through the veins of organized crime, unseen but everywhere. The government cracked down when nations fought the nomads. When governments realized what the nomads had become, the response was immediate and desperate. Conventional policing couldn't contain them. Local task forces failed. Even national agencies found themselves chasing ghosts. The nomads weren't a chapter that could be raided or a clubhouse that could be closed. They were everywhere and nowhere, men without borders, operating above jurisdiction. To fight them, nations had to rewrite their laws. The Netherlands became the first country to make a bold move. After decades of escalating biker violence, Dutch prosecutors built a case to ban the Hells Angels entirely. But their argument didn't rest on typical criminal charges. Instead, they focused on ideology, the culture of violence that defined the nomads. They presented evidence of internal awards for brutality, photos of patches like Filthy Few and Dequeel, and proof that these patches were earned through verified acts of violence. The Dutch courts concluded that the Hells Angels weren't a motorcycle club. They were a paramilitary organization. In 2019, the ban became the first of its kind. Belgium followed soon after, declaring the Hells Angels an illegal organization and criminalizing membership itself. Investigators there had uncovered cross-border coordination between Nomads chapters in Antwerp, Liège, and the Netherlands, involving drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and contract killings. The evidence showed something law enforcement had long suspected. The Nomads weren't just rogue bikers. They were the command layer of a transnational criminal network. In Germany, the crackdown turned violent. Police raids on nomad safe houses revealed military-grade weapons, AK-47s, grenades, and encrypted satellite phones. Yet every raid seemed to provoke new violence. Bombings targeted rival gangs, but also police vehicles and prosecutors' homes. Each act carried a signature precision, timing, and an unmistakable message. We're still here. Canada, the birthplace of the Nomads' modern model, faced its own reckoning during Operation Springtime 2001. It was one of the largest police actions in Canadian history. 1,200 officers, 142 arrests, and the seizure of millions in cash, guns, and drugs. The operation effectively decapitated the Quebec Nomads. Maurice Boucher and nearly all senior leaders were arrested. For a moment, the government believed they had ended the nightmare, but what followed stunned even veteran investigators. Within a year, new Nomads chapters emerged in Trois-Rivières, Montreal, and Halifax. Membership didn't shrink, it increased. The message was clear: dismantle one and another rises. The Nomad structure made them immune to decapitation. There was no central leadership, no single point of failure. Every chapter was autonomous, yet synchronized a criminal version of the internet. To combat this, law enforcement developed new strategies. International task forces began to form joint operations between the FBI, Interpol, and Europol. These units targeted financial assets instead of members, aiming to choke off the lifeblood of the Nomads' empire. Millions were seized in cryptocurrency wallets and offshore accounts. Still, it wasn't enough. For every account frozen, another appeared in a different name, in a different country. Some governments went further. Denmark introduced anti-clubhouse laws, allowing police to confiscate any property used for organized crime meetings. Australia implemented the Criminal Organisation Control Act, giving authorities the power to ban gatherings of suspected nomads and outlaw, even wearing their insignia in public. But even with global coordination, the results were mixed. The nomads adapted faster than any law enforcement model. When physical clubhouses became targets, they went digital. When members were tracked by location, they shifted to encrypted apps and ghost phones. Every government strategy exposed the same truth. Nomads weren't a gang, they were an idea. And you can't arrest an idea. What the world learned from the Nomads is chilling. The most dangerous criminal organizations don't need borders, presidents, or official structures. They only need loyalty forged in violence, communication built on fear, and members willing to die before they talk. The government could ban their patches, raid their homes, and freeze their accounts. But as long as men somewhere were willing to prove their loyalty with blood, the nomads would live on quiet, patient, and waiting for the next war. The terror within, why even the Hells Angels fear the nomads. Among the Hells Angels, there's a rule that defines their entire brotherhood. Angels forever, forever angels. It's a declaration of eternal loyalty, an unbreakable code that binds members for life. But within the nomads, that phrase takes on a darker, deadlier meaning. Because in their world, forever often ends with a bullet. Ordinary angels live by the protection of their chapter. They drink together, fight together, and count on each other for survival. The nomads live in a different reality. Their chapter is not a family, it's a machine. Each member is a moving part, valuable only as long as he performs. Once that value fades, he becomes expendable. And when a nomad is no longer useful, his brothers are the ones who make him disappear. Take Louis Melu Roy, a founding member of the Quebec Nomads. By all accounts, Roy was as loyal as they came, ruthless, efficient, and respected. But when he disagreed with Maurice Montbochet about cocaine pricing and internal profits, his loyalty became irrelevant. Roy vanished after attending a Nomad's anniversary party in June 2000. His body was never found. Investigators later concluded that Roy had been executed by his own brothers. His death ordered by the same men who toasted him hours before. This kind of betrayal wasn't rare, it was doctrine. In the nomad structure, internal discipline is absolute. Members who question authority, leak information, or even hesitate on assignments are removed permanently. The English nomads showed the same ruthlessness when Stephen Grumps Cunningham was killed after a dispute with his chapter. His murder was outsourced to the Dutch Angels, a contract killing that proved even distance couldn't save a marked man. Inside nomad circles, these purges serve a dual purpose. They erase weakness and reinforce fear. Every member knows he's only as safe as his obedience. There are no warnings, no second chances. Survival depends on silence, loyalty, and performance. And that's why even full-patch Hells Angels tread carefully around nomads. Regular angels might brawl, shoot, or intimidate, but nomads are trained to kill efficiently. They don't posture, they don't threaten, they execute. Law enforcement sources describe them as biker assassins, operating with a professionalism more akin to military units than street gangs. Their operations are timed to the second, often carried out in public without panic or hesitation. When the Quebec biker war reached its bloodiest phase, witnesses reported killings so precise that investigators compared them to tactical strikes. The psychological dominance of the nomads inside the Hells Angels can't be overstated. Even high-ranking chapter presidents lower their voices when discussing them. They represent the organization's purest embodiment of violence. A reminder that in the Angels' hierarchy, power doesn't come from seniority or territory. It comes from fear. This terror extends beyond the club. Rivals know that crossing the nomads means total annihilation. Police know that arresting one means retaliation. Informants know that betrayal is a death sentence that can reach across oceans. The nomads' reputation does more than protect them. It paralyzes anyone who might act against them. But beneath the myth lies something more haunting. The nomad structure ensures no one ever truly wins, not even them. The same system that makes them untouchable also consumes them from within. Each killing cements loyalty, but erases trust. Each purge strengthens discipline, but weakens brotherhood. It's an empire built on paranoia, where every handshake hides the possibility of betrayal, and yet they endure. Because in their world, survival isn't about trust. It's about control. The nomads have become the invisible enforcers of the Hells Angels global network. The shadow operators who ensure rules are followed through terror rather than respect. Ask any angel about the nomads, and you'll see it. The pause before they answer, the glance over the shoulder, the change in tone. It's not reverence, it's fear. Fear of the men who don't need patches to prove who they are. Fear of the brothers who kill brothers to keep the machine alive. Fear of the shadow empire that rides under one word. In the early 21st century, Australia's highways echoed with the roar of leather, chrome, and defiance. The Rebels, the country's most powerful outlaw motorcycle club, ruled the roads through intimidation, loyalty, and visibility. Yet, empires built on force are fragile in a changing world. Across continents, a new predator arose: the Albanian mafia, silent, efficient, and global. This is the story of how an iconic criminal empire, forged over decades, was dismantled not in war, but by a paradigm shift that left the rebels powerless. The empire that ruled the roads. In the history of Australian organised crime, few names carried the weight, fear, and spectacle of the rebels. By the early 2000s, they were no longer a local club or a rebellious youth subculture. They had become an empire. To see them on the streets was to witness a force of nature. A procession of leather-clad bikers, engines roaring like thunder, the Confederate skull insignia emblazoned on vests and patches, announcing in unmistakable language that these men and women controlled not just territory, but respect. Their rise was rooted in visibility. Unlike other criminal enterprises that thrived in shadows, the rebels operated in the open. Their power was measured not in bank accounts or quiet influence, but in the kilometers of asphalt they claimed, the clubhouses they fortified, and the sheer spectacle of their gatherings. In 2013, nearly 1,000 members converged in Perth for the annual national run. The scale of the event required the largest police operation since a royal visit. Streets were blocked, bikers thundered through city centres, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with defiance. It was a public proclamation. This was their empire, and anyone who challenged it would feel the weight of their presence. The rebels' business model mirrored their culture. Territorial control was enforced with intimidation and, when necessary, violence. Extortion, local drug and arms trafficking, and public displays of force were all part of a carefully crafted strategy to maintain dominance. Their clubhouses, often fortified and conspicuous, were more than homes. They were symbols of power. Each location marked a claim over a neighborhood, a city block, or a highway stretch. Harley-Davidsons weren't just motorcycles. They were instruments of a brand that equated chrome and leather with lawlessness and authority. Central to the rebels' empire was hierarchy and loyalty. Unlike other criminal groups that operated as decentralized cells, the rebels were built around a singular authority, the national president. Decisions were top-down, and loyalty was personal. This structure allowed for cohesion across dozens of chapters, even as rivalries, disputes, and external pressures tested the organization. Members were bound together by an identity as much as by oaths. To wear the colors was to declare allegiance not only to a club, but to a lifestyle, a worldview, and a code. The rebels' strength came from this unity, yet, as history would prove, the same structure carried the seeds of fragility. Visibility, which had been their most potent weapon, was also their Achilles heel. Law enforcement agencies could map their influence simply by following the processions, noting the clubhouses, and recording the faces behind the patches. Anti-association laws, surveillance, and raids capitalized on the very symbols that made the rebels intimidating. But for decades, this tension between power and vulnerability remained a delicate balance. The rebels thrived because the world had no answer to their brand of public intimidation. At the heart of the empire was Alex Vela, the figure who would define the rebels for over 40 years. Known as the Maltese Falcon, Vela was the embodiment of the club's philosophy: loyalty, charisma, controlled violence, and absolute authority. Born in Malta in 1953, he arrived in Australia as a young immigrant with little more than determination and skill. He worked bricklaying jobs, bounced at nightclubs, and labored on farms, all while honing a capacity for both strategy and brutality. By 1973, he rose to national president, a position he would hold for 4 decades. Under his leadership, the rebels were not just feared, they were untouchable in a way few criminal organizations had ever been. Vela's approach fused the streetwise with the business-minded. Compensation from a motorcycle accident helped him establish a motorcycle import business, growing wealth alongside influence. Clubhouses expanded, chapters multiplied, and the empire stretched across the nation. Even when law enforcement seized assets, raided facilities, or targeted members, the rebels endured. Vela's personal authority kept feuds at bay, managed competing interests, and maintained a fragile balance across a sprawling, often chaotic organization. The rebels were an empire that demanded to be seen, a kingdom measured in horsepower, chrome, and loyalty. Their streets, clubhouses, and runways were stages on which power was performed daily. Yet, as history would show, the very principles that had propelled them to dominance, their visibility, Their reliance on personal authority and their cultural identity rooted in force would make them vulnerable in ways the analog world could not anticipate. They were built for a world of turf wars and public spectacle, but the 21st century was introducing a predator that would render their empire obsolete without firing a single shot. In this first act, the rebels were unstoppable, a symbol of analog power in a digital world yet to come. They were loud, proud, and everywhere. But as they ruled the roads, another story was unfolding silently in the shadows, a story of efficiency, invisibility, and a criminal model that would challenge everything the rebels believed about power. Brotherhood before business. The rebels, like all outlaw motorcycle clubs, did not begin as a criminal enterprise. They were a subculture born from post-war alienation, a society still recovering from scars both visible and unseen. In the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, motorcycles were more than machines. They were vehicles of independence for those who could not afford cars, symbols of rebellion for those who did not fit in. From these humble beginnings, a tribal culture emerged, one that placed loyalty, identity, and community above all else. Australia's first outlaw club, the Gladiators, formed in 1960, marked the first stirrings of this culture. But it was in 1969 in Brisbane that Clint Jacks founded the club that would define the country's criminal landscape, the Rebels. Their ethos was simple but absolute. Brotherhood was sacred, and the patch on the vest was a declaration of belonging. To be a rebel was to be part of a fraternity, one that rejected conventional society while embracing a fiercely independent code of conduct. This culture shaped every facet of their criminal activities. Territorial control was not simply about profit, it was a demonstration of identity. Public displays of force, the loud processions, the brawls, and the ritualized confrontations with rivals were acts of branding as much as acts of intimidation. Each chapter operated like a microcosm of the larger empire, its members bound together by shared rituals, shared colors, and a collective identity that demanded absolute loyalty. In the streets of Perth, Rockhampton, and Albany, the rebels were not just feared, they were understood. They were the embodiment of a culture where honor, visibility, and identity fused with violence. The culture of visibility was a double-edged sword. It made the rebels predictable to their enemies, but it also created cohesion, trust, and a sense of invincibility. Members knew that their strength lay not just in physical dominance, but in reputation. A single act of cowardice could be career-ending. A public display of loyalty reinforced one's place in the hierarchy. This system, though informal, governed behavior across hundreds of members and dozens of chapters. It created stability in an otherwise chaotic criminal world. Yet, beneath this veneer of unity, the culture itself was evolving. By the early 2000s, a generational shift was underway. Younger recruits, often referred to by insiders as the Nike Bikies, were less concerned with motorcycles or tradition. Their attraction to the rebels was transactional: status, money, and opportunity. Loyalty was no longer sacred, it was negotiable, contingent on personal gain. This shift was subtle at first, hidden beneath the leather vests and the roar of engines, but over time it would prove corrosive. The very culture that had built the rebels' empire was quietly eroding from within. Despite this internal evolution, the rebels' structure was formidable. Chapters were organized hierarchically, but tied together through a centralized leadership. National President Alex Vella, later known as the Maltese Falcon, was the linchpin. His authority extended across decades and distances. He resolved disputes, enforced discipline, and maintained cohesion, even as members came and went. As rivalries flared, and as law enforcement probed and raided their operations, in a world of analog networks, Vella's charisma and control were unmatched. This centralized loyalty model was inseparable from the rebels' cultural identity. Members were socialized from the start to accept hierarchy as natural. Leadership was personal, not bureaucratic, and Vella's word was law. Chapters that attempted to challenge him found themselves isolated, ostracized, or forcibly reintegrated. This model allowed for coordinated operations across states, ensuring that no act of defiance went unnoticed. It was a system that rewarded conformity and punished betrayal, and it worked until the world changed. The rebels' criminal activities were extensions of their culture. Extortion, drug distribution, and arms trafficking were conducted within the context of visibility and personal reputation. Clubhouses were not only operational hubs, but symbols of power and pride. Every biker procession, every public act of aggression, reinforced the image of omnipresence. To the rebels, power was measured in loyalty, in the roar of motorcycles, and in the fear their symbols inspired. Business was inseparable from identity, profit and culture were intertwined. However, this cultural emphasis on visibility and hierarchy created vulnerabilities. It provided law enforcement with clear targets and a blueprint for infiltration. It also fostered rigidity. While the world of organized crime was beginning to globalize, to adopt technological solutions and stealth strategies, the rebels remained an analog empire, committed to traditions that had once made them unbeatable. In the late 2000s, the rebels' culture, once their greatest strength, became a source of strategic blindness. Loyalty was fragmenting, generations were clashing, and the analog model of power could not compete with the rising tide of globalized, invisible criminal networks. The foundation of their empire, brotherhood, and visibility would soon be tested not by rivals on the street, but by predators who understood that in the 21st century, the rules of power had changed. The rebels had built an empire that was as cultural as it was criminal, bound by leather, ritual, and devotion to identity. Yet, the first signs of decay were evident, foreshadowing a collapse that would be as quiet as it was absolute. Their brotherhood, the core of their power, was about to confront an enemy that did not understand or care about the rules of loyalty, visibility, or public spectacle. And in that collision, the age of analog empires would meet the digital predators of the new world. The Maltese Falcon. No empire survives without a king, and for the rebels, that king was Alex Vela, known across the criminal world as the Maltese Falcon. Born in Malta in 1953, Vela arrived in Australia in the 1960 seconds, a young immigrant with little more than determination, grit, and a capacity for both charm and violence. Barely able to read or write, he worked bricklaying jobs, bounced at nightclubs, and labored on farms, but he carried with him a quiet intelligence and an instinct for power that would define the rebels for decades. Vela's rise was meteoric. By 1973, just 1 year after joining the rebels, he ascended to the position of national president, a role he would hold for 40 years. Unlike the episodic leadership of other outlaw groups, Vela's authority was personal and absolute. His word was law, his decisions unquestioned, and his presence alone commanded loyalty. Across the country, chapters that might have feuded over territory or profit deferred to his judgment. In a world where violence could erupt at any moment, his leadership provided cohesion, stability, and, for the organization, an air of invincibility. Vela was more than a brute. He was a strategist. He understood that power was as much about perception as force. Compensation from a motorcycle accident allowed him to establish a motorcycle import business, creating not only wealth, but legitimacy, a buffer against law enforcement scrutiny. Over time, he built a financial empire alongside the rebels' criminal operations, acquiring property, amassing one of Australia's finest collections of Harley-Davidsons, and establishing business interests that would fund both legal and illicit activity. But it was Vela's command of violence that earned him his fearsome reputation. In the boxing ring, he was Malta's light heavyweight champion, mastering controlled aggression. On the streets, he combined this precision with unpredictability. Rival gangs knew that Vela was capable of both negotiation and brutality, and that he could deploy either with devastating effect. Under his leadership, the rebels maintained an unprecedented balance. Unity enforced through loyalty, intimidation, and the central authority of one man. Yet this centralization was a double-edged sword. The rebels' strength came from the cohesion and trust that Vela inspired, but the empire was also entirely dependent on him. Which could survive the loss of a leader, the rebels' top-down model created a structural vulnerability. All decisions, all disputes, all power flowed through a single individual. If Vela were removed, even temporarily, the entire organization risked paralysis. Despite constant scrutiny from police, the rebels under Vela remained remarkably resilient. Raids and asset seizures, such as the 1995 operation, in which authorities confiscated over $3 million in club assets, were met with legal challenges, negotiation, and recovery. The rebels endured because Vela's personal authority was unmatched, his knowledge of the system intimate, and his charisma magnetic. Members who might have left rival clubs or pursued independent ventures were bound by loyalty to him and the club's identity. Vela's leadership style was also deeply cultural. He was the embodiment of the rebels' values: loyalty, visibility, and strength through public display. He understood the symbolic power of the club's colors, the Harley-Davidson processions, and the fortified clubhouses. Each act, each decision reinforced the club's mythos. In the rebels' world, perception was as important as reality, and Vela was a master at manipulating both. However, his personal authority also created a fragile dependency. By concentrating power in a single figure, the rebels became vulnerable to forces that could disrupt or remove that authority. Unlike other threats that could be confronted on the streets, certain dangers were systemic, invisible, or bureaucratic, and Vela's absence could cripple the entire empire. For decades, this weakness remained theoretical, hidden behind the fortress of his charisma and experience. As the 2000s progressed, cracks began to form. Generational shifts within the club challenged the old guard, creating tensions that Vela managed with the authority of a king. Younger members were less motivated by identity and brotherhood, more by profit and opportunity, a change that would eventually exacerbate the organization's vulnerability. Yet, at this stage, Vela remained the unifying principle, the gravitational center around which the rebels revolved. To understand the fall of the rebels, one must understand Alex Vela. He was not merely a leader, he was the embodiment of the organization itself. His exile in 2014 would not be the defeat of the rebels in battle, it would be the removal of the central force holding an empire together. What he built over decades, cohesion, authority, and the mythos of invincibility, was now entirely dependent on a single human being. In the story of the rebels, Vela represents the pinnacle and the paradox of analog power. He was capable of building a national empire through loyalty, visibility, and force. Yet the very model that made him successful would make the rebels fragile in a rapidly changing criminal world. Under the Maltese Falcon, the rebels were an empire to be reckoned with, but they were also an empire tied to a single mortal axis, one that history would eventually remove with surgical precision. The war that blinded the king. At the height of the rebels' power, the club faced a challenge that seemed, at first, quintessentially old school: a territorial invasion. In the late 2000s, a chapter of the Canadian rock machine arrived in Perth. To the rebels, this was more than a nuisance, it was a provocation, a direct affront to their dominance. In the culture of outlaw motorcycle gangs, territory was sacred. The streets were not merely roads, they were symbols of control, identity, and authority. To allow another gang to operate unchecked was to risk not only profits, but reputation. The response was immediate and spectacular. The rebels deployed their members across Perth in displays of force that were as theatrical as they were violent. Processions of motorcycles, loud and visible, paraded through the city's entertainment districts. Clubs, tattoo parlors, and businesses associated with the rock machine became targets of arson and intimidation. Molotov cocktails shattered windows, cars were set ablaze, and brawls erupted in nightclubs and public streets. In March 2011, the conflict reached a peak when the rebels' Western Australian president, Nick Martin, was shot in an assassination attempt outside his home. The war was textbook rebels, brutal, public, and defiant. For the members, it reinforced their identity as street warriors. Their power was measured in visibility, in spectacle, in the chaos they could create on the asphalt. Law enforcement chronicled the conflict like an action movie script. Tactical raids, armored vehicles battering down doors, arrests, and widespread property damage. The city became a battleground, the streets a theater of gang mythology. To the untrained eye, the rebels were untouchable, dominating their enemies through sheer presence and aggression. Yet this very focus on public violence masked a critical problem. While the rebels were consumed with defending and reclaiming territory in Perth, they were blind to the real threat emerging silently in the background. Albanian organized crime syndicates were expanding in Australia, not through violence, but through efficiency, stealth, and infiltration. They were seizing control of supply chains, establishing cannabis grow houses in anonymous suburban homes, and integrating into legitimate businesses. The street war with the rock machine created a distraction, drawing resources, attention, and energy away from the structural shifts occurring in the criminal underworld. The Rock Machine conflict was more than a tactical mistake. It was a strategic miscalculation. The rebels measured power by the volume of their engines, the length of their processions, and the intimidation factor of their attacks. But the Albanian syndicates were redefining power. They did not need visible dominance. Their strength was invisible, measured in global supply networks, secrecy, and operational efficiency. While the rebels fought for street corners and public displays of control, the Albanians were quietly capturing the markets that funded organized crime, creating a system the rebels were ill-prepared to contest. Internally, the war exacerbated tensions that had been quietly simmering. Younger members, less committed to loyalty and tradition, grew frustrated with the constant risk and instability. Generational divides deepened as older members tried to enforce codes of conduct, while newer recruits prioritized profit over allegiance. The rebels' centralized leadership, anchored by Alex Vela, struggled to manage both the external conflict and the internal erosion of trust. The war in Perth became a microcosm of the broader challenges facing the club. A reliance on visibility and aggression in a world that was beginning to reward discretion and strategy. Law enforcement, meanwhile, observed the spectacle with both alarm and calculation. The rebels' public violence provided detailed intelligence, patterns of movement, the location of clubhouses, and the identity of key players. Police raids, arrests, and intelligence operations leveraged the visibility that the rebels prized. Yet despite this, the club's cohesion under Vela allowed them to survive the immediate conflict with the Rock Machine largely intact. They had won the streets, but the victory came at a cost they would only understand later. The war blinded the rebels to the subtle but decisive transformation taking place elsewhere in the underworld. While they measured strength in motorcycles and fists, Albanian syndicates measured it in markets, logistics, and anonymity. The club's obsession with immediate, visible threats created a tunnel vision that prevented recognition of a systemic challenge. A predator that did not fight like the rebels, but hunted like a shadow, invisible until it was too late. By the time the dust settled in Perth, the rebels had reaffirmed their identity and impressed their dominance on the city. Yet the victory was Pyrrhic. Their resources were drained, their attention consumed, and their organizational focus narrowed. What they saw as a war for survival was, in truth, a diversion from the structural shift that would ultimately dismantle their empire. In fighting for territory, they ignored the marketplace, the very foundation of power in the new age of organized crime. The Rock Machine conflict would go down in history as a quintessential example of the rebels' analog worldview. Power expressed in public spectacle, identity reinforced through violence, and threats met with aggression. But it also revealed the limitations of that worldview. In the 21st century, real power was no longer measured in streets held or battles won, but in systems controlled, networks infiltrated, and markets dominated. The rebels had fought a war to prove their strength, only to discover that the battle that truly mattered had already been won quietly, invisibly, and far from the roaring engines of Perth. A new criminal species. While the rebels thundered through Australian streets, another force was emerging quietly, almost imperceptibly, on the other side of the world. In the Balkans, the collapse of communism in the 1990 seconds plunged Albania into chaos. The fall of the state, coupled with widespread corruption and the collapse of pyramid schemes that bankrupted millions, created a perfect environment for a new model of organized crime. Out of this turmoil rose a criminal entity that would eventually outmatch the rebels, not through visible power, but through precision, stealth, and corporate-like efficiency. The Albanian mafia, structured around tightly knit family clans, operated under a code known as Besa, meaning trust or the keeping of promises. These clans formed impenetrable social units, where loyalty was guaranteed by blood, tradition, and honor. Unlike the rebels, whose cohesion depended on personal allegiance to a leader and a shared cultural identity, the Albanians' strength lay in secrecy, discipline, and decentralized execution. Law enforcement infiltration, internal betrayal, and public exposure posed far greater challenges to outlaw bikies than to these clan-based syndicates. Their business model was a study in operational efficiency. While biker gangs fought for streets, the Albanian syndicates captured markets. Cocaine distribution became a vertical integration exercise. Instead of relying on intermediaries in Europe, Albanian groups forged direct relationships with Colombian cartels, acquiring high-quality cocaine at a fraction of the price competitors paid. This approach, classic corporate strategy applied to crime, allowed them to control supply chains, maximize profit, and maintain a competitive edge. Their operations were global, coordinated through professional facilitators, lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, rather than through visibility and intimidation. This new breed of organized crime was unrecognizable to the rebels. Power was measured not in motorcycles or patches, but in logistics and discretion. Empty suburban houses became decentralized grow houses. Businesses were used to launder profits. Port access, shipping contracts, and corporate fronts ensured operations could continue unnoticed. Unlike biker gangs, they did not need to assert dominance through spectacle or violence. They existed everywhere, yet were unseen. Their operations were surgical, efficient, and remarkably resilient. By the late 2000s, while the rebels were consumed by street wars with the rock machine, the Albanians were building infrastructure in plain sight. Intelligence reports later revealed networks of cannabis cultivation, cocaine importation, and money laundering extending from Europe to Australia, all orchestrated with a precision that the rebels' analog empire could not match. Where the rebels had patches, the Albanians had spreadsheets. Where the rebels had processions, the Albanians had encrypted communications and professional facilitators. The contrast could not have been starker. The rebels fought for immediate, visible gains: territory, reputation, dominance. The Albanians, in contrast, focused on long-term structural advantage, supply chains, market control, and the invisibility that made law enforcement intervention difficult. While biker gangs invested heavily in guns, clubhouses, and motorcycles, Albanian operations leveraged anonymity, technology, and legal loopholes. Their power was sustainable because it was invisible. Their reach was global, and their footprint almost undetectable. This new paradigm rendered the traditional model of organized crime, epitomized by the rebels, obsolete. In a world where enforcement agencies were increasingly sophisticated and surveillance increasingly intrusive, visibility became liability. Public intimidation, mass brawls, and flamboyant processions were no longer advantages, they were vulnerabilities. The Albanian mafia had understood the rules of the 21st century before the rebels even realized the game had changed. The rise of the Albanian mafia also highlighted the limitations of loyalty-based organizations. While the rebels' cohesion depended on personal allegiance to Alex Vela and the shared mythology of the club, the Albanian clans relied on enforceable social contracts embedded in family and culture. This meant that even if one branch of a network was compromised, the system could continue to operate. Unlike a centralized leadership vulnerable to removal or exile, Albanian operations were resilient, modular, and self-sustaining. By the time Australian law enforcement began to recognize the threat, the Albanians had already captured the real sources of criminal power: supply chains, financial flows, and market control. The rebels, fighting old wars for visibility and street dominance, were ill-prepared to compete in this new arena. The analog model of brute force and brotherhood could not withstand the precision, discretion, and corporate methodology of this new criminal species. The story of the Albanian mafia is not one of spectacle, but of patient, deliberate evolution. It is a tale of adaptation to chaos, of exploiting gaps in governance and law enforcement, and of building a criminal empire designed for the modern world. Where the rebels embodied an analog, visible form of power, the Albanians epitomized a digital, invisible, and market-driven model, and in that quiet evolution lay the seeds of the rebels' ultimate downfall. The rise of this new criminal species set the stage for the extinction of the rebels. The analog dinosaurs of Australian organized crime were about to face a predator that could not be intimidated, outgunned, or scared into submission. They would not be defeated in the streets, but rendered irrelevant in the boardrooms, warehouses, and encrypted networks of a globalized underworld. The empire that once thundered across Australian highways would soon discover that the rules of power had changed and that adaptation was no longer optional. Markets replaced territory. While the rebels measured their strength in streets, controlled and rival gangs intimidated, the Albanian mafia operated according to a very different principle: control of the market. By the early 2010 seconds, the Albanians had redefined organized crime in Australia, demonstrating that power no longer required visibility or violence, it required efficiency, strategy, and global integration. In the cocaine trade, this new model became brutally clear. Instead of purchasing through intermediaries or paying inflated European wholesaler prices, Albanian syndicates established direct relationships with the source. Colombian cartels. This vertical integration allowed them to acquire cocaine at $4,000 to $5,500 per kilo, a fraction of the $22,500 competitors paid through the traditional networks. The result was a product of higher purity and lower cost, a market dominance that the rebels and other OMCGs could not contest. They were no longer competing for street corners or nightclubs, they were being priced out of the real business of organized crime. The Albanian strategy went beyond mere product acquisition. They diversified their operations, infiltrating legitimate businesses to conceal illegal activity and laundering profits through real estate, luxury goods, and financial instruments. Each transaction was carefully calculated to minimize exposure and maximize return. While the rebels engaged in extortion, public intimidation, and highly visible drug sales, Albanian operations remained almost entirely invisible, blending seamlessly into the legal economy. Crucially, this market-centric approach allowed Albanian syndicates to outlast conventional law enforcement strategies. Where biker gangs could be disrupted by raids on clubhouses or arrest of prominent leaders, Albanian operations were modular. If one cell were compromised, the network continued functioning. Supply chains were protected through layers of intermediaries, professional facilitators, and corruption of key officials in ports and distribution hubs. The mafia's reach was invisible, efficient, and resilient, everything the rebels were not. By the late 2000s, the disparity was undeniable. The rebels, still invested in analog tactics of visibility and force, were losing influence not because of direct confrontation, but because the Albanians had captured the economic levers of the underworld. Streets could be defended, and clubhouses fortified. But market dominance dictated longevity, profitability, and ultimately survival. The analog measures of power biker processions, patch displays, and violent reputation were increasingly irrelevant in a globalized criminal ecosystem. The cultural contrast between the two groups amplified the gap. The rebels' identity was tied to brotherhood, tradition, and spectacle. Money and profit were important, but secondary to loyalty and image. Albanian clans, in contrast, prioritized efficiency and results. Loyalty was codified through Besa, a principle that guaranteed trust while allowing for operational flexibility. Members were expected to perform and deliver, and the hierarchy was functional rather than theatrical. This difference in mindset proved decisive. The rebels fought for territory, reputation, and respect. The Albanians captured markets, profits, and influence. This shift in strategy became painfully visible in Australia. Albanian groups controlled the distribution of cannabis and cocaine in major urban centers, established suburban grow houses that operated under the radar, and leveraged global networks to secure supply and distribution. Their operations were shielded by legitimate facades, real estate businesses, import-export companies, and professional services that insulated them from the kind of attention drawn by the rebels' highly visible conflicts. Where the rebels had public dominance, the Albanians had structural dominance. Even when law enforcement attempted to intervene, the difference in models was evident. Raids against biker gang clubhouses disrupted operations temporarily, but the Albanian networks remained largely untouched. Their cells were decentralized, their profits laundered, and their hierarchy insulated from exposure. In effect, the traditional metrics of gang power, territory, reputation, and violence could no longer be used to measure influence or predict outcomes. The rebels were battling an invisible enemy, operating according to a logic they did not understand. Ultimately, the story of markets replacing territory highlights a fundamental transformation in organized crime. Real power had shifted from streets to supply chains, from force to strategy, from visibility to invisibility. By capturing the market, the Albanian mafia had made the analog methods of the rebels not just outdated, but structurally obsolete. The spectacle of leather and chrome could no longer compete with the quiet efficiency of spreadsheets, encrypted communication, and global logistics. The consequence for the rebels was stark. Their traditional strengths, loyalty, visibility, and aggressive displays of dominance were insufficient in a world where real control was exercised through markets and supply. The streets they once ruled were increasingly irrelevant. The battles they waged for reputation had no bearing on the Albanians' profits or influence. In the emerging 21st century underworld, dominance would be measured not by intimidation, but by operational efficiency and market share. As the Albanian mafia expanded its reach and perfected its strategy, the rebels remained tethered to an analog model that was rapidly becoming extinct. Streets and clubhouses, once symbols of absolute power, now represented vulnerability. The war for territory had blinded the rebels to the structural shifts in global crime, and by the time they noticed, it was too late. The age of the analog outlaw was ending, and the era of invisible, market-driven criminal empires had begun. Rot from within. While the Albanian mafia quietly consolidated market power, the rebels were struggling with a crisis that no rival gang could inflict. Internal decay. For decades, the club had thrived on loyalty, shared identity, and devotion to the ideals of brotherhood. Members were bound together by personal allegiance to Alex Vela and a cultural mythology rooted in visibility, territory, and public dominance. But by the late 2000s, the fabric of this brotherhood was fraying. Generational shifts created tension within the organization. Younger members, often recruited directly from prisons, were drawn less by the ideal of outlaw freedom and more by the allure of fast money and status. These were the Nike Bikies, a term coined by criminologists to describe a new breed of member. Transactional, opportunistic, and focused on immediate gain rather than loyalty. Unlike older members who valued reputation, ritual, and long-term cohesion, the Nike Bikies measured success in cash flow, personal advantage, and exploitation of club resources. The impact on the rebels' structure was profound. The hierarchy that had been reinforced through decades of personal loyalty was now undermined by self-interest. Internal disputes over money, territory, and leadership decisions grew more frequent. Chapters that once coordinated seamlessly under Vela's central authority now became battlegrounds of mistrust and rivalry. Lower-ranking members were aware that loyalty was no longer absolute. Allegiance had become conditional, a currency to be traded rather than a bond to uphold. This generational shift intersected with a period of strategic distraction. The ongoing wars with rivals like the Rock Machine and the Mongols had drained resources, attention, and lives. The leadership was overstretched, attempting to maintain public dominance while managing an increasingly restless and self-interested membership. In many ways, the rebels' culture, once a source of strength, became a vulnerability. The values that had inspired decades of unity, visibility, spectacle, and loyalty no longer aligned with the motivations of the new members, creating an internal mismatch that would prove fatal. The first signs of mass disillusionment appeared in the early 2010 seconds. Reports from law enforcement and independent criminologists described chapters where internal disputes were escalating. Members openly criticized leadership, questioned the allocation of funds, and even refused orders. Rituals, once sacred, were ignored or mocked. The psychological cohesion that had bound the rebels together for decades was eroding, leaving the organization vulnerable not only to external threats, but to internal collapse. By 2024, the fractures had reached a breaking point. In Western Australia, the local chapter, feeling abandoned during its war with the Mongols and frustrated with national leadership under Damien Vela, reached a tipping point. Carl Labrook, a 25-year veteran of the club and highly respected WA boss, confronted the leadership over issues of integrity, resource allocation, and loyalty. The response was catastrophic. Labrook, along with 36 members, handed in their colors in a mass resignation. This was more than a loss of personnel, it was a symbolic and structural implosion. The rebels' culture of loyalty had been hollowed from within. The very principles that once unified the organization were now the source of its collapse. Members who had devoted decades to the club defected to rival gangs, most notably the Comancheros, in acts that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Entire chapters dissolved, leaving a void that the rebels could not fill. The internal rot did not just weaken operational capability, it eroded the club's identity. The once feared brand of the rebels, the patches, the motorcycles, the public displays of power, lost meaning when the members who embodied it abandoned it. Without cohesion, loyalty, and a central authority, the rebels became a fragmented shell of their former selves. Public dominance could not compensate for the internal collapse. The timing of this decay was critical. While the rebels were losing cohesion, the Albanian mafia and other modern criminal syndicates were expanding their market dominance, exploiting both the rebels' distraction and their internal instability. The contrast could not have been starker. A disciplined, market-driven organization exploiting opportunities quietly, while the analog empire of leather and chrome collapsed under its own contradictions. Ultimately, the story of the rebels' internal rot is a cautionary tale about the fragility of organizations built solely on personal loyalty and cultural mythology. The club that once inspired fear across Australia's highways was undone not by superior firepower or public attacks, but by the slow, relentless erosion of trust, the rise of opportunistic members, and the inability of leadership to adapt to changing motivations. It was a chronic illness that no violent spectacle could cure. By the time external forces acted, the rebels were already hollowed out. Their infrastructure, once formidable, had weakened. Their chapters were divided. Their loyalty had become transactional. The Albanian mafia, the new predator in the criminal ecosystem, would not even need to confront them directly to claim supremacy. The internal collapse had prepared the ground for a quiet extinction, a decay from within that made the final blow inevitable. The bureaucratic guillotine, even as internal decay hollowed the rebels from within, an external force was preparing to deliver a strike that would make their internal rot catastrophic. Unlike the explosive raids or bloody street wars they were accustomed to, this would be a surgical, bureaucratic maneuver, a decapitation of the organization without a single bullet fired. The target was Alex Vella, the Maltese Falcon, the singular figure whose authority had sustained the rebels' empire for over 4 decades. Vella's leadership was both the club's greatest strength and its fatal vulnerability. His charisma, decisiveness, and control over chapters nationwide made him indispensable. Under his rule, the rebels' empire, spanning over 70 chapters and thousands of members, operated with remarkable cohesion. Despite the chaos and violence inherent to outlaw biker culture, Vella was the center of gravity. His presence alone maintained discipline, loyalty, and unity. Remove him, and the organization risked implosion. That opportunity arrived in June 2014. At the time, Alex Vella was visiting his native Malta, the country of his birth and the place where he had fled for both personal and family reasons. During his absence, the Australian government, under then Immigration Minister Scott Morrison, made a decisive move. Vella's residency visa was cancelled on character grounds. After nearly half a century in Australia, Vella was now officially barred from returning. His exile was absolute, permanent, and legally unassailable. For an organization that relied on personal allegiance to a single leader, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Damien Vella, Alex's nephew, assumed nominal leadership, but the transition was fraught. Damien lacked both the charisma and the authority of his uncle. Chapters that had once followed orders unquestioningly now debated directives, challenged decisions, and prioritized personal interest over collective loyalty. The carefully maintained hierarchy unraveled almost overnight. The rebels' culture, built on Vella's centralized authority, was ill-equipped to survive his removal. For decades, members had deferred judgment, resolved disputes, and maintained unity because of the Maltese Falcon's presence. With him gone, those mechanisms vanished. Long-standing grievances that had been suppressed bubbled to the surface. Chapters became autonomous, rivalries flared, and internal discipline weakened. Without a unifying figure, the rebels were not just leaderless, they were unmoored. The psychological impact on members was equally profound. Many had identified their own power and identity with the central figure of Alex Vella. To lose him was to lose the heart of the organization itself. Loyalty, once an unbreakable bond, became fragile. Members questioned whether their allegiance to the rebels still had meaning. and whether the risks of involvement outweighed the benefits. This uncertainty triggered defections, mass resignations, and in some cases outright betrayal. Western Australia, a region with one of the most active and respected chapters, became the first major casualty. Carl Labrook, the 25-year veteran WA boss, had long been frustrated by what he perceived as a lack of support from national leadership. With Alex Vella exiled, Labrook saw the organization as rudderless. The result was a dramatic rupture. Labrook, along with 36 members, handed in their colors in a mass resignation. More shocking still, many of these defectors joined longtime rivals, including the Comancheros. The club's brand, once synonymous with loyalty and territorial dominance, was fractured beyond repair. The decapitation also highlighted a critical vulnerability of the analog power model. The rebels had relied on a central figure for cohesion, enforcement, and operational oversight. While this centralized authority had allowed them to maintain control for decades, it created a single point of failure. Modern law enforcement, recognizing this, did not need to engage in prolonged gang wars or elaborate surveillance. By removing the Maltese Falcon, they had struck at the very heart of the rebels' organizational DNA. Across Australia, the effect was swift and total. Chapters in Canberra, Sydney, and Melbourne experienced similar destabilization. Members who had once adhered strictly to the rebels' code of conduct now questioned their commitment. Patches were handed in, allegiances shifted, and the organization's public presence began to shrink. The streets that had once reverberated with the roar of rebel motorcycles grew quieter. The empire, already weakened by internal decay and strategic distraction, now faced the irreversible effects of a lost central authority. The bureaucratic guillotine, executed with legal precision, was a lesson in modern law enforcement strategy. It demonstrated that in the 21st century, organizational collapse need not require guns, explosives, or high-speed chases. Sometimes, a single administrative act and immigration decision could achieve what decades of raids and arrests could not. By striking at the leader, authorities exploited the rebels' structural weakness, creating a power vacuum that no successor could fill. Alex Vella, the exiled king of an empire he had built from scratch, now found himself powerless. Thousands of kilometers away in Malta, he watched the disintegration of a world he had shaped over 4 decades. His exile was not just personal, it was emblematic of the obsolescence of the analog, leader-centric model. The rebels, once the apex predators of Australia's criminal landscape, were now prey to the changing rules of power, both internal and external. The bureaucratic guillotine had done its work. The rebels were leaderless, fragmented, and vulnerable. Their internal rot, combined with the strategic invisibility of rival syndicates, set the stage for the final chapters in the collapse of one of the most iconic outlaw empires in Australian history. The digital trap. By the late 2010 seconds, the rebels, like much of the global underworld, were attempting to adapt to the digital age. The analog world of face-to-face communication, clubhouses, and physical meetings was giving way to encrypted messaging platforms. What had once been the rebels' strength, the ability to operate openly, intimidate rivals, and maintain loyalty through presence, was now a liability. The underworld required discretion, speed, and secrecy, and the rebels struggled to adjust. In 2018, the global criminal landscape experienced a seismic shift. Phantom Secure, one of the most widely used encrypted communication platforms for criminals worldwide, was dismantled by the FBI. Its CEO was arrested, servers seized, and thousands of criminals, including outlaw bikies, Albanian syndicates, and other organized crime groups, found themselves suddenly disconnected. Panic spread across the underworld. How could large-scale operations continue without a secure means of communication? Law enforcement, recognizing an unprecedented opportunity, developed a bold plan. Rather than attempting to hack or infiltrate existing platforms, they decided to create their own, a bespoke, encrypted network that would appear impenetrable to criminals but allow authorities full visibility. This operation became known as Anom, a digital Trojan horse designed to exploit the underworld's blind trust in technology. The platform itself was deceptively simple. Custom Android devices running a modified operating system, stripped of normal functions, were distributed, with the encrypted messaging app hidden behind a calculator interface. Users were led to believe that they had access to a secure, exclusive network. In reality, every message sent through ANOM was secretly copied to a law enforcement server, allowing real-time surveillance of global criminal activity. The criminals believed they had found salvation, but they were in the ultimate trap. The rollout relied on trust and influence within the criminal world. Hakan Ayek, a fugitive and high-profile Australian drug trafficker associated with the Comancheros, was unknowingly recruited as the platform's lead distributor. His endorsement, which the underworld considered a seal of credibility, allowed ANOM to penetrate even the most secretive networks. The rebels, desperate for secure communications, were among those who adopted the system, believing it would protect their operations from law enforcement scrutiny. By 2021, the platform had reached critical mass. Tens of thousands of devices were active in over 100 countries, used by more than 300 criminal syndicates, including the remnants of the rebels' empire. For the rebels, ANOM represented a lifeline, a way to coordinate fragmented chapters, manage drug operations, and maintain some measure of control in a world they no longer dominated. Yet the very tool they relied upon would accelerate their collapse. Operation Ironside, the law enforcement codename for the surveillance campaign, was unprecedented in scale and sophistication. FBI and AFP analysts monitored millions of messages, intercepting conversations about drug shipments, money laundering, and even murder plots. The rebels, along with their Albanian competitors and other criminal organizations, spoke freely, believing their communications were secure. Their assumptions of invisibility became the instrument of their destruction. The consequences for the rebels were immediate and devastating. While they were already fragmented due to internal rot and the exile of Alex Vela, ANOM allowed authorities to observe the precise structure of the organization. Hierarchies, financial flows, supply chains, and internal disputes were all laid bare. Law enforcement could see the fractures created by the Nike bikies, mass defections, and declining loyalty in real time, preparing the ground for targeted arrests and raids. In Australia, Operation Ironside culminated in June 2021. Over 4,000 officers executed simultaneous raids across the country, targeting clubhouses, suburban homes, and businesses linked to the rebels. Hundreds of search warrants were carried out, firearms confiscated, cash seized, and high-level members arrested. For the rebels, the illusion of control shattered. The secure network they relied upon was, in fact, a one-way mirror controlled by law enforcement. Every plan, every secret, every private communication had been exposed. The psychological impact was equally profound. Members who had trusted one another implicitly now discovered that the platform they had relied upon for coordination had betrayed them. Bonds of loyalty and brotherhood, already weakened by internal decay and leadership vacuum, collapsed under the weight of evidence that their actions were monitored in real time. The rebels' analog culture of visible strength, loyalty, and intimidation had no defense against the invisible digital predator. By the end of the operation, the rebels were effectively paralyzed, chapters disbanded, high-profile members were imprisoned or defected to rivals, and the once-feared patch lost its value as a symbol of power. The ANOM sting had not just disrupted operations, it had destroyed trust, the very foundation upon which the club had been built. The analog dinosaurs of Australia's criminal underworld had been outmaneuvered not by bullets or clubhouses, but by encrypted messages, invisible servers, and the precision of a global law enforcement coalition. The digital trap illustrates a fundamental lesson in modern criminality. Visibility is no longer power. Invisibility is. The rebels, who had thrived in a world of spectacle, had become extinct in a world of stealth. Their downfall was complete, accelerated by technology they believed would save them. The analog age of leather, chrome, and territorial dominance had ended, and the digital predator, globalized and efficient, had already claimed the landscape. Extinction in silence. By mid-2021, the rebels were no longer a fearsome empire. They were a relic of a bygone era. Decades of visibility, loyalty, and territorial dominance, once their greatest strengths, had become liabilities. The internal decay, the generational shift toward transactional loyalty, and the exile of Alex Vela had hollowed the club from within. Operation Ironside delivered the final, decisive blow, exposing every secret, every plan, and every fracture to law enforcement. Chapters dissolved, members defected to rivals, and the brand that had once terrorized highways lost all meaning. The rebels' leather and chrome, their colors, and their iconic patches became symbols not of power, but of obsolescence. Where they had once measured authority in public intimidation, motorcycles, and violent displays, they now faced a world in which power was silent, efficient, and invisible. Their analog model of organized crime could not survive in the digital corporate-style networks that had replaced it. Meanwhile, the Albanian mafia and other modern syndicates adapted and survived. Clan-based, decentralized, and focused on market dominance, their operations absorbed lessons from the rebels' collapse. By prioritizing stealth, efficiency, and global integration, they remained resilient to both internal decay and law enforcement intervention. The analog dinosaurs had been extinguished, but the new predators thrived, proving that survival depended not on spectacle, but on adaptability and invisibility. The fall of the rebels was not a dramatic war or a final shootout. It was a quiet extinction, an evaporation of influence, structure, and identity. Streets they once controlled, clubhouses they once defended, and reputations they once projected were all left empty. Alex Vella, exiled in Malta, remained the symbolic king of a kingdom that no longer existed. In the end, the rebels' story is a chronicle of transition. It demonstrates that in the 21st century, real power is not displayed with leather vests or roaring motorcycles. It is exercised through markets, global networks, and stealth. The rebels did not lose a battle. They were outpaced by a paradigm shift. Their disappearance offers a cautionary tale. The era of analog dominance has ended, replaced by invisible, efficient, and corporatized criminal empires. The roar that once echoed across Australian highways had faded forever, leaving only the silence of a vanished empire. Have you ever wondered what really happens the moment you step into an outlaw biker party? Before music, drinks, or greetings, you are being evaluated for threat, value, and risk. Nothing is accidental. Every movement is logged. Every reaction is remembered. This world does not reward curiosity or confidence, only control and awareness. Stay until the end, because what seems like social etiquette is actually a system designed to test, filter, and eliminate mistakes with permanent consequences for everyone involved.
The Outlaws Motorcycle Club, known as the AOA, American Outlaws Association, is a 1% outlaw motorcycle club that was founded in McCook, Illinois, in 1935.
How you enter the room. Entry is the first test, and it begins before a word is spoken. In outlaw biker environments, entry is not symbolic, it is functional. The moment someone crosses the threshold, they are logged mentally by multiple people at once. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition built from years of conflict, infiltration, and retaliation. Every unfamiliar presence represents potential disruption, surveillance, or provocation. Entry determines how much attention follows for the rest of the night. Invitation status matters immediately. Outlaw gatherings are rarely open by accident. Even public-facing events carry internal guest expectations. Showing up without prior acknowledgement signals either ignorance or disregard, both of which are treated as liabilities. In groups where violence creates consequences beyond the room, unpredictability is managed aggressively. Unannounced presence forces members to evaluate intent instead of enjoying routine. That alone shifts the room's posture. Appearance communicates alignment. Patches, shapes, cleanliness, and placement are read instantly. Colors announce affiliation, rank, history, and sometimes rivalry. New-looking patches suggest inexperience or recent formation, which raises different questions than worn ones. Lack of patches does not mean invisibility. Groups moving with coordination but without identifiers trigger separate scrutiny. Organization implies backing. Backing implies obligation. Obligation implies risk. Body mechanics matter. Hesitation at the door, uncertainty about where to stand, or confusion over basic spatial norms exposes unfamiliarity. Outlaw spaces are structured even when they appear casual. Members know where to place helmets, where to move, and where not to linger. Someone searching for cues signals they do not belong to the environment yet. That does not guarantee conflict, but it guarantees attention. Timing also registers. Arriving late, early, or during transitional moments, like shift changes or private discussions, affects perception. These groups operate on rhythm. Interrupting it, intentionally or not, is noticed. Entry during sensitive moments forces members to pause internal business and reassess security. That pause carries irritation, even if nothing is said. Behavior during entry is weighted more heavily than later actions. The first seconds establish whether someone understands restraint. Slow movement, controlled posture, and limited scanning reduce perceived threat. Overconfidence increases it. The absence of panic matters more than bravado. Calm signals predictability. Predictability reduces perceived danger. Silence during entry is not passive, it is strategic. Speaking too early introduces variables before the assessment is complete. Outlaw systems value information asymmetry. The less offered, the safer the position. Early talkers reveal insecurity, motive, or ignorance prematurely. Entry is not the time to announce identity, intent, or personality. Finally, entry creates memory. Even if the night passes without incident, the first impression becomes reference material. Future encounters are filtered through it. In environments where grudges persist longer than friendships, that memory carries weight. Entry does not end once inside. It continues as long as the person remains present, shaping how closely they are watched and how quickly consequences follow if something goes wrong. Eye contact and visual discipline. Eye contact is treated as information exchange, not courtesy. In outlaw biker spaces, the face is considered a liability if it is hidden, and a risk if it is uncontrolled. Visual discipline is learned behavior shaped by interrogation, confrontation, and violence. Members are trained by experience to read intent faster than language allows. The eyes provide that access. Covering the face disrupts assessment. Sunglasses indoors, partially removed helmets, or any obstruction between the eyes and the room creates friction. This is not about etiquette. It is about trust calibration. Obscured eyes prevent intent evaluation, which forces others to assume worst-case scenarios. In groups that manage threats proactively, uncertainty is treated as a problem that must be resolved, not tolerated. Direct eye contact functions as a stability signal. It indicates presence, awareness, and readiness to be held accountable for reactions. Avoidance suggests anxiety, deception, or hostility. Overly aggressive staring suggests a challenge. The balance is narrow and culturally specific. Members notice whether eye contact is brief, reactive, or sustained too long. Each variation triggers a different internal response. Blink rate, pupil focus, and gaze drift are unconsciously tracked. These are not myths. High-stress environments condition people to recognize stress leakage. Excessive blinking, fixed stares, or scanning for exits communicate pressure. Pressure suggests vulnerability. Vulnerability attracts testing. Testing escalates risk. Visual discipline also applies to how someone observes others. Openly scanning patches, watching hands too closely, or tracking specific individuals' signals, concerns, or intent. That attention is noticed and mirrored. In closed hierarchies, observation is permitted only after permission is established. Premature scrutiny disrupts power balance. Outlaw culture values controlled neutrality. The ideal visual posture is calm acknowledgement without interest. This signals that the person is not searching for dominance, validation, or escape. Anything outside that range requires explanation, even if none is given verbally. Explanation in these environments often takes physical or social form. Eyes also reflect alignment. Loyalty, contempt, fear, and resentment surface there first. Members accustomed to internal discipline learn to mask reactions, but outsiders rarely do. The inability to regulate facial response exposes emotional volatility. Volatility is dangerous. It leads to unpredictable reactions under pressure, which threatens group stability. Visual behavior is remembered. Someone who appears evasive or hostile during a first encounter will be monitored more closely later. Someone who appears calm and unreadable reduces future scrutiny. This is not approval, it is risk management. Lower perceived risk receives less attention. Importantly, visual discipline is not submission, it is containment. The goal is to present no challenge and no weakness simultaneously. That balance signals social awareness rather than fear. Fear invites control, defiance invites correction, awareness invites tolerance. Failure in this area rarely causes immediate confrontation. Instead, it alters how others interact later. Questions become sharper, patience shortens, mistakes are less forgiven. In systems where escalation follows patterns, early visual missteps quietly move someone closer to consequences without warning. Eye contact, or lack of it, is one of the fastest filters used. It operates silently, continuously, and without appeal. Once judged, that assessment becomes the baseline from which all future. Speech control and verbal exposure. Speech is treated as evidence. In outlaw biker environments, words are not social filler. They are material that can be stored, repeated, and used. Most conflicts do not originate from actions, but from language that introduces motive, ego, or contradiction. Verbal exposure creates traceable risk, and risk is rarely ignored. Early talking is the most common mistake. Speaking before understanding the room introduces variables that cannot be recalled. Stories, explanations, or personal histories offered without request signal insecurity or a need for validation. Neither is respected. Members do not need narratives to assess someone. They observe behavior instead. Bragging accelerates scrutiny. Claims of toughness, experience, or affiliation invite verification. Verification rarely benefits the speaker. Outlaw systems are built around proof, not assertion. Individuals who feel compelled to establish credibility verbally are assumed to lack it structurally. That assumption triggers testing. Humor is not neutral. Jokes reveal hierarchy, awareness, impulse control, and boundary recognition. Familiarity-based humor without established rapport is interpreted as overreach. Sarcasm misfires frequently. What is tolerated among friends becomes provocation among strangers. Verbal miscalculation is often treated as intentional, regardless of intent. Alcohol amplifies exposure. Reduced inhibition leads to oversharing, misjudged confidence, and reactive speech. Many people enter environments safely and create problems only after speaking excessively. The transition from anonymity to visibility is often self-inflicted. Silence would have preserved neutrality. Information leakage is cumulative. Details about background, affiliations, beliefs, or grievances build a profile. Profiles create leverage. Even harmless information can become ammunition when reframed. In hierarchical systems, asymmetry of information is power. Speaking too much reverses that balance. Interrupting conversations or inserting opinions uninvited signals entitlement. It challenges the existing social order. Outlaw culture enforces rank implicitly. Speaking out of turn disrupts that structure. Disruption invites correction, either socially or physically. Disclaimers worsen impact. Phrases intended to soften statements often precede offense. Attempting to preempt reaction acknowledges awareness of boundary violation. That awareness implies choice. Choice implies responsibility. Responsibility eliminates plausible deniability. Speech also reveals emotional regulation. Defensive tone, rapid explanation, or reactive denial indicate internal pressure. Pressure attracts attention. Calm, minimal responses deflect it. Members accustomed to interrogation and surveillance recognize stress patterns quickly. Silence is not absence, it is an observation. Those who speak less gather information while giving none. This asymmetry protects them. Eventually, most people expose themselves through speech. The patient listener gains an advantage without effort. Verbal mistakes rarely trigger immediate consequences. Instead, they mark the speaker. Marked individuals receive less tolerance. Future errors are interpreted through that lens. The threshold for response lowers quietly. In environments governed by memory and retaliation, spoken words persist longer than actions. Speech cannot be undone, it can only be managed. Those who fail to manage it often discover that consequences arrive later, detached from the original moment, when context no longer protects them. Topics that trigger internal fracture. Certain subjects function as destabilizers. In outlaw biker environments, religion and politics are treated as structural threats, not intellectual disagreements. These topics introduce identity conflicts that override hierarchy, loyalty, and shared risk. Groups built on cohesion avoid variables that fracture internal alignment. The avoidance is not ignorance. Many members hold strong beliefs. The discipline lies in containment. Outlaw systems prioritize operational stability over personal expression. Expressing divisive beliefs inside these spaces creates camps, even when no one intends to choose sides. Once camps exist, authority weakens. Political discussion escalates faster than expected. It reframes relationships through ideology rather than shared experience. Brothers become representatives of opposing narratives instead of individuals bound by history. That shift changes how actions are interpreted. Neutral behavior becomes suspect. Silence becomes political. This erosion happens quietly. Religion introduces moral hierarchy. Moral hierarchy challenges organizational hierarchy. When belief systems define righteousness, they compete with club discipline. Disagreement becomes a moral offense rather than a preference. Offense invites defense. Defense escalates conflict. The chain reaction is predictable and destructive. Family fractures offer precedent. These subjects regularly sever blood relationships. Outlaw groups are not structured to absorb that level of emotional volatility. Members do not owe each other forgiveness beyond agreed boundaries. Introducing family-level conflict into a criminal organization is reckless. External actors exploit these fractures. Law enforcement and rival groups benefit from internal division. Ideological disputes create informants, defectors, and retaliation. Avoidance is a security measure, not etiquette. Engagement also creates obligation. Once a position is stated, silence later appears deceptive. Consistency is demanded. That pressure restricts movement within the group. Flexibility is lost. Members who value autonomy avoid self-imposed constraints. The rule applies even to shared beliefs. Agreement today becomes expectation tomorrow. Expectation becomes pressure. Pressure becomes resentment. Resentment undermines loyalty. Silence prevents that progression. Outlaw environments favor practical alignment over philosophical consensus. The system functions because members agree on enforcement, not worldview. Introducing a belief-based hierarchy undermines enforcement credibility. Discipline becomes selective. Those who ignore this rule often misinterpret tolerance as interest. A lack of immediate reaction does not indicate acceptance. It indicates containment. The response is deferred, not dismissed. Consequences rarely surface during the discussion. They emerge later through altered support, reduced protection, or increased scrutiny. Members who once received backing find themselves isolated during conflict. Isolation in these systems is dangerous. Avoidance preserves cohesion. It limits variables that cannot be controlled. In spaces where control equals survival, anything that weakens it is treated as a threat, even if expressed calmly. Why bars and bartenders are treated as assets. Protection of bars and bartenders is not sentimental, it is operational. In outlaw biker culture, certain locations function as semi-controlled environments. These places are not owned in name, but are defended in practice. A bar that regularly hosts club members becomes an extension of their infrastructure. Damage to it creates exposure. Bars serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They are meeting points, information hubs, and pressure release zones. Members use them to observe outsiders, communicate informally, and maintain visibility without appearing organized. That balance matters. When a bar becomes unstable, all of those functions collapse at once. Bartenders occupy a critical position. They control alcohol flow, which directly affects behavior. They also observe everything. They notice who arrived agitated, who is escalating, and who is forming alliances across tables. Their vantage point gives them early warning capability. In volatile environments, early warning prevents incidents that draw attention. Information travels quietly through bartenders. This is not always explicit. Patterns are shared through pauses, refusals, or subtle redirection. A drink delayed can cool a situation. A quiet signal can summon support before voices rise. Members trust bartenders who understand the room's rhythm. That trust is earned through consistency, not loyalty declarations. Disrespecting a bartender is interpreted as destabilizing the environment. It introduces chaos at the control point. Alcohol-fueled aggression aimed at staff signals a loss of discipline. Loss of discipline threatens everyone present. Immediate correction protects the system, not the individual being defended. Ownership relationships matter. Sometimes a member is romantically involved with staff. Sometimes the club has a financial interest. Sometimes the bar owner relies on the club for protection against rival groups. These connections create mutual dependence. A problem inside the bar extends beyond the room. Neutral ground is valuable. In outlaw ecosystems, neutral spaces are rare and fragile. Once compromised, they cannot be reclaimed easily. A burned location draws law enforcement attention, forces relocation, and disrupts routines. Routine disruption increases error rates. Errors lead to arrests. Bars also function as filters. Outsiders reveal themselves there before entering deeper spaces. Behavior in a bar determines access later. If that environment becomes unsafe, the filter fails. The group loses an early assessment layer. Protection is preventative. It is easier to remove one disruptive individual than to manage fallout from an uncontrolled incident. Quick, decisive response sends a message without explanation. That message preserves order. Outsiders often misread these actions as excessive or personal. They are neither. They are calculated. The goal is to maintain the viability of the space. Emotional reactions are irrelevant. Bartenders who understand this dynamic gain protection. Those who do not are replaced or avoided. Trust is conditional and revocable. It depends on discretion and situational awareness. The bar itself becomes part of the club's memory. Incidents there carry weight long after the night ends. Protecting it preserves not just a location, but a history of controlled outcomes. In environments where every incident is logged mentally and revisited later, safeguarding the bar is safeguarding future stability. The response to disrespect reflects that priority, even when the reason is not explained. How the patch is used as leverage. The patch is not just identification, it is authority condensed into fabric. In outlaw biker culture, the patch represents collective violence, shared consequences, and historical retaliation. Most members understand this and carry it with restraint. Some do not. Those individuals use the patch as leverage rather than responsibility. This behavior is recognizable. It appears as unnecessary pressure on outsiders, exaggerated enforcement of minor norms, or deliberate provocation where no threat exists. The individual relies on the assumption that backup is guaranteed. That assumption emboldens behavior that would not occur without group protection. The patch becomes insulation for personal insecurity. These actions are not always sanctioned. Clubs tolerate a degree of internal dysfunction to preserve unity. However, unchecked misuse creates external problems. Outsiders react unpredictably when pressed. Escalation attracts attention. Attention invites law enforcement. This chain reaction endangers everyone, not just the instigator. Testing behavior often targets perceived low-risk individuals. Outsiders without visible affiliation, smaller groups, or individuals showing hesitation become convenient targets. The goal is not resolution, but affirmation. The instigator seeks validation through dominance displays that carry minimal personal risk due to numerical advantage. This misuse damages internal discipline. When members observe patch-backed bullying, respect erodes quietly. Authority becomes associated with the ego rather than structure. Over time, this weakens leadership credibility. Leaders then must manage fallout created by individuals acting beyond necessity. Outsiders frequently misinterpret these encounters as personal. They are rarely that. The target is interchangeable. The behavior would have occurred regardless of who was present. Understanding this does not make it safer, but it clarifies the motive. Responding emotionally feeds the dynamic. Engaging rarely benefits the outsider. Reaction confirms effectiveness. Calm. Withdrawal denies validation. In environments where numbers and surveillance favor the club, confrontation without backing is a losing equation. The patch ensures asymmetry. Internally, repeated misuse attracts scrutiny. Members who create unnecessary exposure eventually face correction. Correction may be formal or informal, but it arrives. Clubs value control over chaos. Individuals who jeopardize that balance become liabilities. The presence of these dynamics does not negate the patch's meaning. It highlights its power. Power attracts misuse. Systems tolerate some abuse until the cost outweighs benefit. When that threshold is crossed, consequences follow, Understanding that the patch can be weaponized psychologically is critical. It explains why some interactions escalate without cause. The leverage is not about the moment. It is about reinforcing perceived dominance within the hierarchy. Outsiders who recognize this pattern avoid taking bait. Avoidance is not weakness, it is risk calculation. In outlaw ecosystems, survival depends on recognizing when authority is being displayed theatrically versus operationally. The patch carries weight, whether used responsibly or not. Its misuse creates stories, grudges, and attention. Those accumulate. Eventually, someone pays for that accumulation. The individual wielding it rarely chooses when or how. How small disrespect is measured. Small disrespect is never small in outlaw biker environments. It is treated as diagnostic, not emotional. These spaces operate on calibrated responses, and subtle violations are used to measure temperament, awareness, and self-control. The reaction matters more than the act itself. Minor slights are often ambiguous by design. A shoulder bump without acknowledgement, a joke that lands slightly off, a delay in returning personal space. These moments are not always accidental, and they are not always hostile. They function as probes. How someone responds provides more information than confrontation ever could. Immediate escalation signals poor judgment. Overreaction marks someone as unstable or inexperienced. In groups where retaliation carries collective cost, instability is dangerous. Members do not want unpredictability attached to their environment. Someone who reacts loudly or physically to minor provocation is flagged quickly. Ignoring every slight is also noticed. Complete passivity suggests fear or lack of self-respect. Neither earns protection. The balance lies in controlled acknowledgement without escalation. That balance demonstrates situational awareness rather than dominance. Timing plays a role. Responding too quickly shows emotional impulsivity. Responding too late suggests confusion. Measured delay indicates assessment. Assessment implies intelligence. Intelligence reduces perceived risk. Outlaw culture values proportionality. Not every action requires response. Not every response requires confrontation. Understanding which is which separates those who survive from those who become stories. Many outsiders fail because they treat all disrespect as equal. It is not. Alcohol complicates this process. Impaired judgment increases misinterpretation. What might have been ignored, sober becomes personal under influence. This shift is predictable and exploited. Those testing boundaries know when to apply pressure. Small disrespect also reveals ego attachment. Individuals who need to assert themselves publicly expose vulnerability. That vulnerability becomes leverage. Others learn how to move them emotionally. Emotional control protects against manipulation. Observers matter. These moments rarely occur in isolation. Others are watching, even if they appear disengaged. Reactions are logged, patterns form. Someone who repeatedly mishandles minor slights is categorized as a future problem. Withdrawal is often the safest response. Leaving after a minor incident preserves neutrality without signaling defeat. The incident remains unresolved publicly, which prevents escalation. In environments where exit narratives form quickly, clean departure limits damage. Staying to prove resilience often backfires. Presence after a slight invites further testing. Each test increases probability of misstep. Probability accumulates until failure occurs. Many serious incidents begin with someone choosing to remain after their instincts warned them otherwise. Respect is not earned through confrontation. It is earned through consistency. Consistent calm under pressure reduces attention. Reduced attention reduces risk. Risk management is the true goal, not dominance. Outlaw systems do not reward pride. They reward predictability. Someone who can absorb minor pressure without reaction demonstrates control. Control earns tolerance. Tolerance allows survival. Misreading small disrespect often leads to disproportionate consequences. The original act becomes irrelevant. The response becomes the issue. In environments governed by memory and enforcement, that shift is permanent. Understanding that small moments carry diagnostic weight explains why some nights turn violent without warning. The warning was there. It was just subtle. How exit behavior is interpreted. Exit matters more than arrival. In outlaw biker environments, how someone leaves determines how the night is remembered. Entry creates an impression. Exit confirms or corrects it. This is because departure happens after assessment, alcohol, observation, and quiet judgment. By the time someone leaves, the room already knows who they are. A clean exit signals control. It shows awareness of timing, surroundings, and personal limits. Leaving without announcement reduces attention. Attention during exit invites last-minute complications. Complications are unpredictable and often unnecessary. Members notice who slips out versus who makes departure a performance. Excessive goodbyes are interpreted as insecurity or a desire for recognition. Circling the room to shake hands creates visibility at the worst moment. By then, alcohol has altered moods, alliances have shifted, and patience has thinned. Visibility increases exposure. Exposure increases risk. Rushed exits are also flagged. Leaving abruptly without cause suggests panic, conflict, or awareness of impending trouble. That raises suspicion. Suspicion lingers after departure. Later encounters are colored by unanswered questions. Transportation choices matter. Who someone leaves with, how many people accompany them, and whether they appear coordinated are observed. Movement patterns outside the venue are monitored informally. This is habit formed from retaliation cycles and law enforcement avoidance. Sloppy exits compromise group security. Emotional state during exit is critical. Visible frustration, intoxication, or agitation indicates unresolved tension. That tension is remembered. Members do not forget who left angry. They anticipate follow-up issues. Anticipation alters future tolerance. Exit timing reflects judgment. Leaving before escalation shows awareness. Staying too long increases exposure to others' mistakes. Many incidents occur in the final moments of gatherings when fatigue and alcohol converge. Experienced members recognize this pattern and exit early. Silence during exit preserves ambiguity. Ambiguity protects. Explaining reasons for leaving introduces narrative. Narratives invite interpretation. Interpretation creates opinions. Opinions solidify into reputation. Reputation persists longer than presence. Outlaw systems value those who minimize disruption. A departure that leaves no trace maintains neutrality. Neutrality allows future access. Drama during the exit restricts it. Members remember the complicated endings. Parking areas are extensions of the venue. Many confrontations occur there. Exit behavior includes how someone navigates that space. Lingering, pacing, or engaging in heated conversations outside escalates vulnerability. The threshold has already been crossed. Security posture is lower. Clean exits are strategic. They deny opportunity for final tests, challenges, or confrontations. They reduce witness pools. They prevent misinterpretation of intent. They protect both the individual and the group from unnecessary escalation. Those who survive these environments long-term learn that the night is not over until they are home. Opinions solidify into reputation. Reputation persists longer than presence. Outlaw systems value those who minimize disruption. A departure that leaves no trace maintains neutrality. Neutrality allows future access. Drama during the exit restricts it. Members remember the complicated endings. Parking areas are extensions of the venue. Many confrontations occur there. Exit behavior includes how someone navigates that space. Lingering, pacing, or engaging in heated conversations outside escalates vulnerability. The threshold has already been crossed. Security posture is lower. Clean exits are strategic. They deny opportunity for final tests, challenges, or confrontations. They reduce witness pools. They prevent misinterpretation of intent. They protect both the individual and the group from unnecessary escalation. Those who survive these environments long-term learn that the night is not over until they are home. The bar is not the danger. The transition is. Mistakes during transition carry delayed consequences that surface later. Exit behavior updates internal records. Someone who entered cautiously but exited recklessly redefines their profile. Someone who maintains control throughout reinforces it. That record influences how quickly intervention occurs if future issues arise. In outlaw biker culture, departure is not an afterthought. It is the final assessment point. It confirms whether the individual understands the environment or merely survives it temporarily. That distinction matters the next time paths cross. How reputation forms faster than you think. Reputation in outlaw biker environments does not require repeated contact. It forms rapidly, often within a single night, and it hardens quickly. This happens because these systems rely on shared memory rather than formal records. Observations are exchanged quietly, reinforced by pattern recognition, and rarely challenged once a consensus forms. Reputation is not built on what someone intends, it is built on what others interpret. Intent is irrelevant if behavior creates risk. A single misjudgment can outweigh multiple neutral actions because risk is weighted more heavily than compliance. One unstable moment matters more than an hour of calm presence. Information spreads laterally. Members talk after events, not during them. Conversations happen privately, away from outsiders. These discussions refine impressions and correct individual bias. By the next encounter, the room often already agrees on how to treat someone. That agreement shapes behavior toward them before they realize anything has changed. Reputation is contextual. Someone may be tolerated in one setting and flagged in another. However, once negative traits are assigned, they follow. Loudness, impulsivity, insecurity, or disrespect become labels. Labels simplify decision-making. Simplified decisions reduce hesitation during conflict. Attempts to correct reputation verbally usually fail. Explaining oneself reinforces the problem by adding narrative. Narrative invites scrutiny. Scrutiny reopens the evaluation under worse conditions. Silence would have preserved ambiguity. Ambiguity is safer than defense. Positive reputation is quieter. It is associated with predictability, restraint, and low impact. Individuals who do not create work for others are valued. Value does not equal friendship. It equals tolerance. Tolerance allows continued access without supervision. Negative reputation increases monitoring. Monitoring increases the probability of detection for minor errors. Minor errors escalate faster when the subject is already flagged. This creates a feedback loop. Once inside it, escape is difficult. Reputation also influences response thresholds. Someone viewed as unstable will receive quicker correction. Someone viewed as controlled will receive warnings or redirection instead. The same action produces different consequences depending on prior assessment. Law enforcement pressure amplifies this dynamic. Groups under scrutiny cannot afford unpredictable associates. Anyone who draws attention becomes a liability. Liability is managed decisively. Reputation determines how quickly someone is categorized as such. Outsiders often underestimate how little interaction is required to be remembered. Presence alone is enough. Absence does not erase memory. Time does not reset the assessment. Only consistent behavior over multiple encounters can modify perception, and even then, skepticism remains. Reputation extends beyond the room. It affects how someone is discussed when they are not present. That discussion shapes future interactions in new locations. Someone who believes they are unknown may already be anticipated. The most dangerous assumption is anonymity. These environments do not operate on anonymity. They operate on recognition. Recognition does not require introduction. It requires exposure. Understanding how fast reputation forms explains why some individuals feel targeted without knowing why. The cause is often behind them, not in front. The reaction they face is a delayed response, not spontaneous hostility. Reputation is the invisible structure guiding behavior towards someone. It dictates patience, tone, and enforcement. Once established, it moves independently of the individual's current actions. In systems built on memory and consequence, reputation is not reputation in the social sense. It is a risk profile. That profile determines how problems are handled when they arise, and problems, eventually, always arise. Law enforcement pressure shapes every interaction. Law enforcement is a constant, even when invisible. In outlaw biker environments, every interaction is filtered through awareness of surveillance, informants, and accumulated cases. This pressure alters behavior at a structural level. It explains why tolerance is limited, reactions are controlled, and mistakes are handled quickly. Presence is always evaluated for risk of exposure. Unknown individuals introduce uncertainty. Uncertainty threatens operational security. Members assess whether someone could be recording, reporting, or simply careless enough to attract attention. Even unintentional exposure is treated as dangerous. Intent is secondary to outcome. Informants are not hypothetical. History has proven their existence repeatedly. Clubs have lost leadership, territory, and freedom through cooperation from within or near their circles. This reality conditions behavior. Members are trained by consequence to distrust openness. Casual conversation becomes potential evidence. Public incidents draw attention. Attention leads to scrutiny. Scrutiny uncovers patterns. Patterns build cases. This chain is understood deeply. Preventing the first link is prioritized. That is why minor disruptions are corrected aggressively. Allowing small problems to grow risks a larger exposure. Behavior inside social settings reflects this pressure. Loud arguments, visible intoxication, or uncontrolled violence create witnesses. Witnesses create reports. Reports create records. Records never disappear. The group's goal is to minimize documentation opportunities. Law enforcement pressure also explains internal discipline. Members who create exposure are corrected not for moral reasons, but for survival. Correction preserves collective safety. Those who repeatedly endanger the group become liabilities. Liabilities are managed. Outsiders often misinterpret coldness or rigidity as arrogance. It is a caution. Friendly behavior creates openings. Openings create vulnerability. Vulnerability invites infiltration. The cycle is well understood. This pressure affects how exits are managed, how speech is controlled, and how conflicts are resolved. It also explains why forgiveness is limited. Mistakes cannot be undone once observed externally. Mercy increases risk. Law enforcement presence is uneven. Some regions experience constant pressure, others less so. Behavior adjusts accordingly, but the baseline remains. Past experiences shape current responses more than present calm. Under pressure, groups value predictability. Predictable individuals reduce risk. Unpredictable ones increase it. This distinction influences tolerance levels quickly. Understanding this pressure clarifies why environments feel tense, even during calm moments. The tension is structural, not emotional. It does not dissipate with time or familiarity. It is maintained deliberately. Law enforcement may not be in the room, but its influence is. Every decision accounts for future scrutiny. This shapes culture more than any internal code. Those who fail to recognize this often become catalysts for problems they never intended to create. The response they face reflects accumulated fear of exposure, not personal animosity. In outlaw biker culture, freedom is always temporary. The awareness of that fact governs behavior relentlessly. Informants are assumed, not discovered. Informants are not treated as rare exceptions. They are treated as inevitable. Outlaw biker environments operate under the assumption that someone, somewhere in proximity, is feeding information outward. This assumption shapes every interaction, even among long-time associates. Trust exists, but it is compartmentalized and conditional. The idea of total trust is considered naive. History has shown that pressure, leverage, or self-interest eventually converts proximity into cooperation. Arrests, indictments, and long sentences do not happen by chance. They are built from accumulated details, often provided incrementally. This reality forces behavioral discipline. Because informants are assumed, information flow is restricted by default. Conversations are segmented, topics are limited, knowledge is distributed on a need-to-know basis. Outsiders encounter this structure immediately, even if they do not recognize it. Questions are answered vaguely or not at all. Curiosity is treated as a risk. Behavioral inconsistencies attract attention. Someone asking too many questions, repeating details incorrectly, or showing unusual interest in structure or leadership raises flags. These patterns do not prompt confrontation, they prompt distance. Distance is safer than accusation. Informants are rarely exposed through dramatic reveals. They are isolated through reduced access. Their usefulness diminishes as information dries up. This passive containment avoids escalation and limits damage. It also protects against false accusation, which carries its own consequences. Outsiders often mistake this distance for hostility. It is neither personal nor emotional. It is procedural. The system protects itself quietly. Individuals who require explanation are not prioritized. The assumption of informants also explains why reputation matters so heavily. Someone perceived as careless or attention-seeking is considered high risk. High-risk individuals attract law enforcement interest unintentionally. That interest spreads, distance follows. Technology intensifies this pressure. Phones, cameras, and digital trails create permanent records. Casual documentation becomes evidence later. Outlaw environments adapt by minimizing traceable behavior. Those who do not adapt are corrected or excluded. Informants also exist indirectly. Partners, acquaintances, and peripheral figures become sources without realizing it. Information leaks through social channels. The safest information is unshared information. Silence limits collateral exposure. This assumption reshapes social interaction. Warmth is measured. Familiarity is rationed. Oversharing is discouraged. The goal is not paranoia. It is survival under sustained scrutiny. Outsiders who expect transparency misunderstand the environment. Transparency invites exploitation. These systems have learned that lesson repeatedly. Openness is a liability. Understanding that informants are assumed explains the coldness newcomers often feel. It is not rejection, it is insulation. The group is protecting itself from unknown variables. In this context, trust is not a feeling, it is a risk calculation. That calculation changes slowly and never fully resolves. The assumption of informants never disappears. It simply becomes background noise that governs behavior without announcement. Internal hierarchy is always being enforced. Hierarchy in outlaw biker environments is not symbolic or optional. It is active, continuous, and enforced even when it appears invisible. Rank determines access, tolerance, and consequence. This structure exists to prevent chaos. Without it, personal disputes would escalate unchecked and destabilize the group. Hierarchy is communicated through behavior rather than announcement. Who speaks first, who interrupts, who sits where, and who moves all signal position freely. These cues are subtle but consistent. Members learn them through correction, not instruction. Outsiders often miss them until they violate one. Violations are not always corrected immediately. Sometimes they are logged. Logging allows leadership to assess patterns versus accidents. Repeated misalignment triggers a response. Response scales with rank and context. Correction is rarely explained. Explanation invites debate. Debate undermines authority. Lower-ranking members enforce hierarchy indirectly. They watch for breaches and report upward. This reduces the need for overt leadership intervention. It also distributes enforcement responsibility, making the system resilient. Outsiders encountering enforcement may misattribute it to personal hostility rather than structural necessity. Hierarchy also governs conflict resolution. Disputes do not escalate freely. They move upward or are shut down. Unauthorized conflict threatens order. Individuals who bypass structure create instability. Instability invites correction. Rank influences tolerance. Higher-ranking members are granted more leeway. This is not favoritism. It reflects investment. Leaders have proven reliability. Outsiders have not. Tolerance is earned through consistency, not presence. Outsiders often mistake informality for equality. Casual language does not equal standing. Informality exists within boundaries. Crossing those boundaries reveals hierarchy abruptly. Hierarchy protects the group from ego-driven violence. Centralizing authority, it limits personal vendettas. This does not eliminate violence. It controls its timing and direction. Control preserves longevity. Understanding hierarchy explains why some actions are ignored while others provoke a swift response. The action itself matters less than who performed it and where they stand. This context determines interpretation. Those who challenge hierarchy without backing are corrected decisively. Those who respect it gain limited autonomy. Autonomy is the reward for predictability. Hierarchy is always present, even when unspoken. It governs behavior silently. Ignoring it does not weaken it. It triggers enforcement. In outlaw biker culture, hierarchy is a survival infrastructure. Without it, the system collapses under its own volatility. Violence functions as a system, not an outburst. Violence in outlaw biker environments is not random and not primarily emotional. It functions as a regulatory system. Its purpose is to enforce boundaries, correct deviations, and preserve hierarchy. Outbursts happen, but they are considered failures of control, not expressions of strength. The system values predictability over aggression. Most violence is preventative. It occurs early, decisively, and with limited explanation. This prevents escalation and discourages future violations. Allowing disrespect or instability to linger increases the cost later. Early correction minimizes attention and reduces collateral damage. Violence is rarely personal. It is procedural. Individuals often misunderstand this and internalize encounters emotionally. The system does not care about feelings. It cares about outcomes. If behavior threatens stability, it is addressed. Who the person is matters less than what they represent in that moment. Authorization matters. Unapproved violence creates problems. It draws law enforcement attention, invites retaliation, and undermines leadership control. Members who act independently risk internal consequences regardless of justification. Discipline applies inward as well as outward. The visibility of violence is controlled. Public incidents are avoided. When they occur, they are contained quickly. Witnesses increase risk. Risk is managed aggressively. The goal is to resolve issues without creating narratives outsiders can exploit. Violence also communicates internally. It reinforces hierarchy and clarifies boundaries without prolonged discussion. One action can reset behavior across the group. This efficiency is valued in high-risk environments. Outsiders often misread restraint as weakness. It is a calculation. Violence is deployed when it serves the system, not the ego. Ego-driven violence destabilizes. Destabilization invites collapse. Understanding violence as a system explains why some serious violations are met calmly, while minor ones provoke a swift response. The response aligns with perceived risk, not severity in a moral sense. This system persists because it works within the environment's constraints. It limits chaos while maintaining control. Those who fail to recognize this misinterpret signals and place themselves in danger. Violence is not glorified internally. It is treated as a tool with consequences. Every use carries a cost. Costs are weighed carefully. In outlaw biker culture, violence is not the point. Control is. Violence is one method among others to achieve it. Betrayal is expected, not forgiven. Betrayal is built into the risk model. Outlaw biker environments do not operate under the assumption of permanent loyalty. They operate under the expectation that pressure will eventually break someone. This expectation is not cynical. It is experiential. History has proven it repeatedly through arrests, informants, and internal collapse. Loyalty is therefore managed, not trusted blindly. Access is tiered. Information is compartmentalized. Members are given only what they need to function at their level. This limits damage when betrayal occurs. The system absorbs loss rather than pretending it can prevent it entirely. Betrayal rarely arrives dramatically. It unfolds quietly through small concessions, delayed reactions, or selective silence. These behaviors are noticed, patterns are tracked. Once suspicion forms, distance replaces confrontation. Confrontation creates volatility. Distance limits exposure. Forgiveness is rare because it creates precedent. Precedent invites repetition. In environments where betrayal carries legal and physical consequences for others, mercy is interpreted as weakness. Weakness invites exploitation. The cost of misplaced forgiveness is too high. Consequences for betrayal are not always immediate or visible. Sometimes they are social, sometimes they are structural. Access disappears. Protection evaporates. Support is withdrawn. The individual finds themselves isolated when pressure increases. Isolation magnifies vulnerability. Outsiders often misunderstand this process. They expect moral reckoning or explanation. None is required. The system prioritizes survival, not closure. Explanation increases exposure. Silence contains damage. Betrayal also reshapes internal relationships. Members become more guarded. Trust narrows. Hierarchy tightens. These shifts persist long after the event. The memory of betrayal outlasts the individual responsible. Law enforcement benefits from betrayal, but it also accelerates collapse. Once cooperation occurs, pressure increases across the network. The system responds by contracting. Contraction limits opportunity, but preserves core stability. Those who betray are rarely remembered fondly or angrily. They are remembered as a caution. Their names become reference points, not emotions. This depersonalization allows the group to move forward without sentiment. Understanding that betrayal is expected explains why warmth is limited and why trust develops slowly. It also explains why mistakes are not overlooked. Every deviation carries the question of motive. In outlaw biker culture, loyalty is proven through consistency, under pressure, not words. Even then, it is never assumed to be permanent. The system is built to survive betrayal because it knows it will happen again. Collapse is slow, then sudden. Collapse in outlaw biker environments does not begin with a single event. It begins with accumulation. Small compromises, tolerated dysfunction, unchecked exposure, and delayed corrections stack quietly over time. Each alone appears manageable. Together, they create a structural weakness that cannot be reversed once momentum shifts. Early signs are subtle: increased arrests of peripheral figures, reduced attendance at gatherings, heightened internal discipline. Leadership is becoming more insulated. These are defensive responses, not failures. They signal awareness that pressure is rising. The system is attempting to contract to survive. As pressure increases, flexibility decreases. Decisions become conservative. Trust narrows further. Operations slow. This creates frustration internally. Frustration produces mistakes. Mistakes attract attention. Attention compounds pressure. The feedback loop tightens. Law enforcement exploits this phase. Investigations mature. Timelines align. Evidence that once seemed disconnected forms coherent cases. Informants become more valuable. Cooperation increases under the threat of long sentences. The system's assumption of betrayal becomes reality repeatedly in a short span. Internal fractures widen. Members question leadership decisions privately. Attendance becomes inconsistent. Communication becomes fragmented. Hierarchy strains under competing priorities, survival versus cohesion. Authority is challenged indirectly through non-compliance rather than confrontation. Violence during this phase is counterproductive. It draws attention to the system that can no longer absorb. Leadership often suppresses action to avoid exposure. This restraint is misread as weakness by some. Those misinterpretations create internal conflict. External rivals sense vulnerability. Territorial pressure increases. Challenges escalate. The group must now manage internal collapse and external threat simultaneously. Resources are divided. Focus erodes. Collapse accelerates once arrests reach leadership levels. Decapitation disrupts coordination. Replacement leaders lack experience or legitimacy. Decision-making slows further. Confusion spreads. Members act independently, increasing exposure. The final phase arrives quickly. Coordinated arrests, indictments, or asset seizures occur in close succession. The group loses operational capacity almost overnight. What appeared resilient for years becomes inert in weeks. After a collapse, narratives form externally. Internally, silence dominates. Former members reassess risk. Some disappear. Others attempt reintegration elsewhere. Memory persists longer than structure. Collapse is rarely dramatic from the inside until it is unavoidable. The system adapts until adaptation fails. When it fails, there is no recovery, only fragmentation. Understanding collapse explains the tension present even during stable periods. Members know longevity is temporary. Survival is managed, not guaranteed. In outlaw biker culture, collapse is not an anomaly. It is the expected endpoint. The only variable is timing. Why outsiders misjudge safety until it's gone. Most outsiders believe danger announces itself. They expect raised voices, visible aggression, or direct threats. In outlaw biker environments, safety erodes quietly. The most dangerous moments are often calm, controlled, and uneventful on the surface. This misjudgment is what places outsiders at risk long before they realize it. Perceived calm is not actual safety. When a room is quiet, discipline is active, not absent. Members are watching, measuring, and adjusting. Silence does not mean acceptance. It means assessment is ongoing. Outsiders mistake the lack of confrontation for approval, assuming they are blending in. In reality, they are still under evaluation. Familiarity creates false confidence. After a short period, without incident, outsiders relax. Posture loosens. Speech increases. Boundaries blur. This shift is noticed immediately. The change, not the initial behavior, becomes the issue. Consistency matters more than first impressions. Deviation signals loss of control. Another misjudgment comes from delayed consequences. In many social spaces, mistakes trigger immediate reaction. In outlaw environments, response is often deferred. This delay creates the illusion that behavior was acceptable. The response comes later, detached from the original moment, when context no longer protects the individual. Outsiders also misread tolerance as weakness. When minor violations are ignored, it is assumed that limits are flexible. They are not. The system simply has not decided whether correction is necessary yet. Once that decision is made, tolerance disappears instantly. Alcohol intensifies this misunderstanding. As inhibition lowers, perception narrows. Outsiders focus on immediate interactions and miss broader shifts in the room. They fail to notice changes in attention, body positioning, or movement patterns that signal rising concern. By the time those signals become obvious, options are limited. Safety is also misjudged because enforcement is selective. Not everyone is corrected equally. Outsiders see someone else get away with behavior and assume equal treatment applies. It does not. Enforcement depends on risk profile, not fairness. Different people receive different responses for identical actions. Another factor is environmental illusion. Bars, music, and social cues mimic normal nightlife. This disguises the underlying structure. Outsiders rely on familiar rules that do not apply. What feels like a bar is functioning as controlled territory. Treating it as a neutral space creates vulnerability. The most common error is staying too long. Time increases exposure. Each additional moment introduces new variables. New arrivals, changing moods, fatigue, and alcohol shift dynamics continuously. The longer someone remains, the higher the probability of a misstep. Outsiders underestimate this accumulation effect. Safety also disappears during transitions. Movement between spaces, parking areas, and rides home is treated casually by outsiders. These moments are when discipline drops and vulnerability peaks. Many serious incidents occur after the perceived danger has passed. Outsiders often assume intent will be clarified before consequence. It will not. Explanation is not owed. Interpretation replaces intent in these environments. Once interpretation solidifies, the outcome follows. Understanding why safety is misjudged explains why people are often surprised by escalation. They believed nothing was wrong. In reality, multiple thresholds had already been crossed quietly. In outlaw biker culture, danger is not loud, it is procedural. The absence of chaos is not reassurance. It is the warning most people fail to recognize until it is too late. Why observation never stops, even after acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood as safety. In outlaw biker environments, acceptance does not end with observation. It changes its intensity. Once someone is no longer treated as an unknown variable, they become a known quantity that must be managed. Management requires continuous evaluation. Observation never stops because people change under pressure. Early observation focuses on threat. Later observation focuses on reliability. The questions shift from who you are to how consistent you remain. Consistency is tested over time, not moments. Small deviations matter more after acceptance because expectations exist. Violating expectations carries greater consequences than initial unfamiliarity. Comfort is the most common failure point. Once someone feels accepted, vigilance drops. Behavior relaxes. Boundaries are pushed casually. This is when observation tightens again. Comfort introduces risk because it creates an opportunity for mistakes. The system anticipates this and watches for it. Observation is distributed. It is not the responsibility of one individual. Multiple members track behavior informally. Different people notice different things. One observes speech patterns. Another tracks movement. Another watches reactions under stress. Together, these fragments form a composite assessment that is difficult to alter once established. Patterns matter more than incidents. A single mistake can be tolerated if it remains isolated. Repeated small deviations form a pattern. Patterns indicate underlying instability. Instability threatens group predictability. Predictability is non-negotiable. Observation also extends outside formal settings. Behavior in adjacent spaces, associations, and lifestyle choices are noticed indirectly. Information travels through proximity, not inquiry. Someone does not need to be present to be observed. Their actions are reflected through others. Acceptance also increases scrutiny because access expands. With access comes exposure to sensitive environments. Exposure increases risk. Risk demands monitoring. This is not distrust. It is risk management operating as designed. Those who mistake acceptance for immunity often fail quickly. They assume history protects them. It does not. History only sets expectations, and failure to meet expectations triggers a response faster than initial unfamiliarity ever did. Observation includes how someone responds to correction. Resistance signals the ego. Acceptance signals adaptability. Adaptability preserves tolerance. Ego reduces it. The response to being checked often matters more than the original issue. Over time, observation becomes quieter but more consequential. Fewer warnings are given. Fewer explanations are offered. The margin for error narrows. This progression is rarely communicated explicitly. Outsiders expect relationships to stabilize. Outlaw systems do not stabilize. They recalibrate continuously based on pressure, environment, and threat level. Individuals are recalibrated with them. Understanding that observation never ends explains why long-term survival requires sustained discipline. There is no arrival point where caution can be abandoned. Acceptance is not the end of testing. It is the beginning of a different test, one with higher stakes and fewer second chances.